Chapter 10 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. He stopped to dinner that evening and, much to Ruth's satisfaction, made a favorable impression on her father. They talked about the sea as a career, a subject which Martin had at his finger ends. And Mr. Morse remarked afterward that he seemed a very clear-headed young man. In his avoidance of slang and his search after right words, Martin was compelled to talk slowly, which enabled him to find the best thoughts that were in him. He was more at ease than that first night at dinner, nearly a year before, and his shyness and modesty even commended him to Mrs. Morse, who was pleased at his manifest improvement. "He is the first man that ever drew passing notice from Ruth," she told her husband. "She has been so singularly backward where men are concerned that I have been worried greatly." Mr. Morse looked at his wife curiously. "You mean to use this young sailor to wake her up?" he questioned. "I mean that she is not to die an old maid if I can help it," was the answer. "If this young Eden can arouse her interest in mankind in general, it will be a good thing." "A very good thing," he commented. "But suppose, and we must suppose sometimes, my dear, suppose he arouses her interest, too particularly in him." "Impossible," Mrs. Morse laughed. "She is 3 years older than he, and besides, it is impossible. Nothing will ever come of it. Trust that to me." And so Martin's role was arranged for him, while he, led on by Arthur and Norman, was meditating an extravagance. They were going out for a ride into the hills Sunday morning on their wheels, which did not interest Martin until he learned that Ruth, too, rode a wheel and was going along. He did not ride nor own a wheel, but if Ruth rode, it was up to him to begin, was his decision. And when he said good night, he stepped in at a cyclery on his way home and spent $40 for a wheel. It was more than a month's hard-earned wages, and it reduced his stock of money amazingly. But when he added the $100 he was to receive from the examiner to the $420 that was the least the youth's companion could pay him, he felt that he had reduced the perplexity the unwonted amount of money had caused him. Nor did he mind, in the course of learning to ride the wheel home, the fact that he ruined his suit of clothes. He caught the tailor by telephone that night from Mr. Higginbotham's store and ordered another suit. Then he carried the wheel up the narrow stairway that clung like a fire escape to the rear wall of the building, and when he moved his bed out from the wall, found that there was just space enough in the small room for himself and the wheel. Sunday he had intended to devote to studying for the high school examination, but the pearl diving article lured him away, and he spent the day in the white-hot fever of recreating the beauty and romance that burned in him. The fact that the Examiner of the morning had failed to publish his treasure-hunting article did not dash his spirits. He was at too great a height for that, and having been deaf to a twice-repeated summons, he went without the heavy Sunday dinner with which Mr. Higginbotham invariably graced his table. To Mr. Higginbotham such a dinner was advertisement of his worldly achievement and prosperity, and he honored it by delivering platitudinous sermonettes upon American institutions and the opportunity said institutions gave to any hard-working man to rise, the rise, in his case, which he pointed out unfailingly, being from a grocer's clerk to the ownership of Higginbotham's cash store. Martin Eden looked with a sigh at his unfinished pearl diving on Monday morning, and took the car down to Oakland to the high school. And when, days later, he applied for the results of his examinations, he learned that he had failed in everything save grammar. "Your grammar is excellent," Professor Hilton informed him, staring at him through heavy spectacles, "but you know nothing, positively nothing in the other branches, and your United States history is abominable. There is no other word for it. Abominable. I should advise you." Professor Hilton paused and glared at him, unsympathetic and unimaginative as one of his own test tubes. He was a professor of physics in the high school, possessor of a large family, a meager salary, and a select fund of parrot-learned knowledge. "Yes, sir," Martin said humbly, wishing somehow that the man at the desk in the library was in Professor Hilton's place just then. "And I should advise you to go back to the grammar school for at least 2 years. Good day." Martin was not deeply affected by his failure, though he was surprised at Ruth's shocked expression when he told her Professor Hilton's advice. Her disappointment was so evident that he was sorry he had failed, but chiefly so for her sake. "You see, I was right," she said. "You know far more than any of the students entering high school, and yet you couldn't pass the examinations. It is because what education you have is fragmentary, sketchy. You need the discipline of study, such as only skilled teachers can give you. You must be thoroughly grounded. Professor Hilton is right, and if I were you, I'd go to night school. A year and a half of it might enable you to catch up that additional 6 months. Besides, that would leave you your days in which to write, or, if you could not make your living by your pen, you would have your days in which to work in some position." "But if my days are taken up with work and my nights with school, when am I going to see you?" was Martin's first thought, though he refrained from uttering it. Instead, he said, "It seems so babyish for me to be going to night school. But I wouldn't mind that if I thought it would pay, but I don't think it will pay. I can do the work quicker than they can teach me. It would be a loss of time." He thought of her and his desire to have her. "And I can't afford the time. I haven't the time to spare, in fact. There is so much that is necessary." She looked at him gently, and he was a brute to oppose her. "Physics and chemistry, you can't do them without laboratory study, and you'll find algebra and geometry almost hopeless with instruction. You need the skilled teachers, the specialists in the art of imparting knowledge." He was silent for a minute, casting about for the least vainglorious way in which to express himself. "Please don't think I'm bragging," he began. "I don't intend it that way at all. But I have a feeling that I am what I may call a natural student. I can study by myself. I take to it kindly, like a duck to water. You see yourself what I did with grammar, and I've learned much of other things. You would never dream how much. And I'm only getting started. Wait till I get—" He hesitated and assured himself of the pronunciation before he said, "momentum. I'm getting my first real feel of things now. I'm beginning to size up the situation." "Please don't say size up," she interrupted. "To get a line on things." He hastily amended. "That doesn't mean anything in correct English," she objected. He floundered for a fresh start. "What I'm driving at is that I'm beginning to get the lay of the land." Out of pity she forbore, and he went on. "Knowledge seems to me like a chart room. Whenever I go into the library, I am impressed that way. The part played by teachers is to teach the students the contents of the chart room in a systematic way. The teachers are guides to the chart room, that's all. It's not something they have in their own heads. They don't make it up, don't create it. It's all in the chart room, and they know their way about it. And it's their business to show the place to strangers who might else get lost. Now, I don't get lost easily. I have the bump of location. I usually know where I'm at. What's wrong now?" "Don't say where I'm at." "That's right," he said gratefully. "Where I am." "But where am I at? I mean, where am I? Oh, yes, in the chart room. Well, some people—" "Persons," she corrected. "Some persons need guides. Most people do. But I think I can get along without them. I've spent a lot of time in the chart room now, and I'm on the edge of knowing my way about, what charts I want to refer to, what coasts I want to explore. And from the way I line it up, I'll explore a whole lot more quickly by myself. The speed of a fleet, you know, is the speed of the slowest ship, and the speed of the teachers is affected the same way. They can't go any faster than the ruck of their scholars, and I can set a faster pace for myself than they set for a whole schoolroom." "He travels the fastest who travels alone," she quoted at him. "But I'd travel faster with you just the same," was what he wanted to blurt out, as he caught a vision of a world without end of sunlit spaces and starry voids through which he drifted with her, his arm around her, her pale gold hair blowing about his face. In the same instant he was aware of the pitiful inadequacy of speech. God, if he could so frame words that she could see what he then saw. And he felt the stir in him, like a throe of yearning pain, of the desire to paint these visions that flashed unsummoned on the mirror of his mind. Ah, that was it. He caught at the hem of the secret. It was the very thing that the great writers and master poets did. That was why they were giants. They knew how to express what they thought and felt and saw. Dogs asleep in the sun often whined and barked, but they were unable to tell what they saw that made them whine and bark. He had often wondered what it was. And that was all he was, a dog asleep in the sun. He saw noble and beautiful visions, but he could only whine and bark at Ruth. But he would cease sleeping in the sun. He would stand up with open eyes, and he would struggle and toil and learn until, with his eyes unblinded and tongue untied, he could share with her his visioned wealth. Other men had discovered the trick of expression, of making words obedient servitors, and of making combinations of words mean more than the sum of their separate meanings. He was stirred profoundly by the passing glimpse at the secret, and he was again caught up in the vision of sunlit spaces and starry voids, until it came to him that it was very quiet, and he saw Ruth regarding him with an amused expression and a smile in her eyes. "I have had a great visioning," he said, and at the sound of his words in his own ears his heart gave a leap. Where had those words come from? They had adequately expressed the pause his vision had put in the conversation. It was a miracle. Never had he so loftily framed a lofty thought. But never had he attempted to frame lofty thoughts in words. That was it. That explained it. He had never tried. But Swinburne had, and Tennyson and Kipling, and all the other poets. His mind flashed on to his pearl diving. He had never dared the big things, the spirit of the beauty that was a fire in him. That article would be a different thing when he was done with it. He was appalled by the vastness of the beauty that rightfully belonged in it, and again his mind flashed and dared, and he demanded of himself why he could not chant that beauty in noble verse as the great poets did. And there was all the mysterious delight and spiritual wonder of his love for Ruth. Why could he not chant that too, as the poets did? They had sung of love, so would he. By God! And in his frightened ears he heard his exclamation echoing. Carried away, he had breathed it aloud. The blood surged into his face, wave upon wave, mastering the bronze of it, till the blush of shame flaunted itself from collar rim to the roots of his hair. I beg your pardon," he stammered. "I was thinking." "It sounded as if you were praying," she said bravely. But she felt herself inside to be withering and shrinking. It was the first time she had heard an oath from the lips of a man she knew, and she was shocked, not merely as a matter of principle and training, but shocked in spirit by this rough blast of life in the garden of her sheltered maidenhood. But she forgave, and with surprise at the ease of her forgiveness. Somehow it was not so difficult to forgive him anything. He had not had a chance to be as other men, and he was trying so hard, and succeeding too. It never entered her head that there could be any other reason for her being kindly disposed toward him. She was tenderly disposed toward him, but she did not know it. She had no way of knowing it. The placid poise of 24 years without a single love affair did not fit her with a keen perception of her own feelings, and she who had never warmed to actual love was unaware that she was warming now. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Martin went back to his pearl diving article, which would have been finished sooner if it had not been broken in upon so frequently by his attempts to write poetry. His poems were love poems, inspired by Ruth, but they were never completed. Not in a day could he learn to chant in noble verse. Rhyme and meter and structure were serious enough in themselves, but there was, over and beyond them, an intangible and evasive something that he caught in all great poetry, but which he could not catch and imprison in his own. It was the elusive spirit of poetry itself that he sensed and sought after, but could not capture. It seemed a glow to him, a warm and trailing vapor, ever beyond his reaching. Though sometimes he was rewarded by catching at shreds of it and weaving them into phrases that echoed in his brain, with haunting notes, or drifted across his vision in misty wafture of unseen beauty. It was baffling. He ached with desire to express, and could but gibber prosaically, as everybody gibbered. He read his fragments aloud. The meter marched along on perfect feet, and the rhyme pounded a longer and equally faultless rhythm. But the glow and high exaltation that he felt within were lacking. He could not understand, and time and again, in despair, defeated and depressed, he returned to his article. Prose was certainly an easier medium. Following the pearl diving, he wrote an article on the sea as a career, another on turtle catching, and a third on the northeast trades. Then he tried, as an experiment, a short story, and before he broke his stride he had finished 6 short stories and dispatched them to various magazines. He wrote prolifically, intensely, from morning till night, and late at night, except when he broke off to go to the reading room, draw books from the library, or to call on Ruth. He was profoundly happy. Life was pitched high. He was in a fever that never broke. The joy of creation that is supposed to belong to the gods was his. All the life about him, the odors of stale vegetables and soapsuds, the slatternly form of his sister, and the jeering face of Mr. Higginbotham was a dream. The real world was in his mind, and the stories he wrote were so many pieces of reality out of his mind. The days were too short. There was so much he wanted to study. He cut his sleep down to 5 hours, and found that he could get along upon it. He tried 4 hours and a half, and regretfully came back to 5. He could joyfully have spent all his waking hours upon any one of his pursuits. It was with regret that he ceased from writing to study, that he ceased from study to go to the library, that he tore himself away from that chart-room of knowledge, or from the magazines in the reading room that were filled with the secrets of writers who succeeded in selling their wares. It was like severing heartstrings, when he was with Ruth, to stand up and go. And he scorched through the dark streets, so as to get home to his books at the least possible expense of time. And hardest of all was it to shut up the algebra or physics, put the notebook and pencil aside, and close his tired eyes in sleep. He hated the thought of ceasing to live, even for so short a time, and his sole consolation was that the alarm clock was set 5 hours ahead. He would lose only 5 hours anyway, and then the jangling bell would jerk him out of unconsciousness, and he would have before him another glorious day of 19 hours. In the meantime, the weeks were passing, his money was ebbing low, and there was no money coming in. A month after he had mailed it, the adventure serial for boys was returned to him by the youth's companion. The rejection slip was so tactfully worded that he felt kindly toward the editor. But he did not feel so kindly toward the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. After waiting 2 whole weeks, Martin had written to him. A week later he wrote again. At the end of the month, he went over to San Francisco and personally called upon the editor. But he did not meet that exalted personage, thanks to a Cerberus of an office boy, of tender years and red hair, who guarded the portals. At the end of the 5th week the manuscript came back to him, by mail, without comment. There was no rejection slip, no explanation, nothing. In the same way, his other articles were tied up with the other leading San Francisco papers. When he recovered them, he sent them to the magazines in the East, from which they were returned more promptly, accompanied always by the printed rejection slips. The short stories were returned in similar fashion. He read them over and over, and liked them so much that he could not puzzle out the cause of their rejection, until, one day, he read in a newspaper that manuscript should always be typewritten. That explained it. Of course editors were so busy that they could not afford the time and strain of reading handwriting. Martin rented a typewriter and spent a day mastering the machine. Each day he typed what he composed, and he typed his earlier manuscripts as fast as they were returned to him. He was surprised when the typed ones began to come back. His jaw seemed to become squarer, his chin more aggressive, and he bundled the manuscripts off to new editors. The thought came to him that he was not a good judge of his own work. He tried it out on Gertrude. He read his stories aloud to her. Her eyes glistened, and she looked at him proudly as she said, "Ain't it grand, you writing those sort of things?" "Yes, yes," he demanded impatiently. "But the story, how did you like it?" "Just grand," was the reply. "Just grand and thrilling, too. I was all worked up." He could see that her mind was not clear. The perplexity was strong in her good-natured face, so he waited. "But say, Mart," after a long pause, "how did it end? Did the young man who spoke so highfalutin get her?" And, after he explained the end, which he thought he had made artistically obvious, she would say, "That's what I wanted to know. Why didn't you write that way in the story?" One thing he learned after he had read her a number of stories, namely, that she liked happy endings. "That story was perfectly grand," she announced, straightening up from the washtub with a tired sigh, and wiping the sweat from her forehead with a red, steamy hand. "But it makes me sad. I want to cry. There is too many sad things in the world anyway. It makes me happy to think about happy things. Now, if he'd married her, you don't mind, Mart?" she queried apprehensively. "I just happen to feel that way because I'm tired, I guess. But the story was grand just the same, perfectly grand. Where are you going to sell it?" "That's a horse of another color," he laughed. "But if you did sell it, what do you think you'd get for it?" "Oh, $100. That would be the least, the way prices go." "My, I do hope you'll sell it." "Easy money, eh?" Then he added proudly, "I wrote it in 2 days. That's $50 a day." He longed to read his stories to Ruth, but did not dare. He would wait till some were published, he decided. Then she would understand what he had been working for. In the meantime, he toiled on. Never had the spirit of adventure lured him more strongly than on this amazing exploration of the realm of mind. He bought the textbooks on physics and chemistry, and, along with his algebra, worked out problems and demonstrations. He took the laboratory proofs on faith, and his intense power of vision enabled him to see the reactions of the chemicals more understandingly than the average student saw them in the laboratory. Martin wandered on through the heavy pages, overwhelmed by the clues he was getting to the nature of things. He had accepted the world as the world, but now he was comprehending the organization of it, the play and interplay of force and matter. Spontaneous explanations of old matters were continually arising in his mind. Levers and purchases fascinated him, and his mind roved backward to handspikes and blocks and tackles at sea. The theory of navigation, which enabled the ships to travel unerringly their courses over the pathless ocean, was made clear to him. The mysteries of storm and rain and tide were revealed, and the reason for the existence of trade winds made him wonder whether he had written his article on the Northeast trade too soon. At any rate, he knew he could write it better now. One afternoon he went out with Arthur to the University of California, and, with bated breath and a feeling of religious awe, he went through the laboratories, saw demonstrations, and listened to a physics professor lecturing to his classes. But he did not neglect his writing. A stream of short stories flowed from his pen, and he branched out into the easier forms of verse, the kind he saw printed in the magazines. Though he lost his head and wasted 2 weeks on a tragedy in blank verse, the swift rejection of which, by half a dozen magazines, dumbfounded him. Then he discovered Henley, and wrote a series of sea poems on the model of hospital sketches. They were simple poems of light and color, and romance and adventure. Sea lyrics, he called them. And he judged them to be the best work he had done yet. There were 30, and he completed them in a month, doing one a day after having done his regular day's work on fiction, which day's work was the equivalent to a week's worth of the average successful writer. The toil meant nothing to him. It was not toil. He was finding speech, all the beauty and wonder that had been pent for years behind his inarticulate lips, was now pouring forth in a wild and virile flood. He showed the sea lyrics to no one, not even to the editors. He had become distrustful of editors, but it was not distrust that prevented him from submitting the lyrics. They were so beautiful to him that he was impelled to save them to share with Ruth in some glorious, far-off time when he would dare to read to her what he had written. Against that time he kept them with him, reading them aloud, going over them until he knew them by heart. He lived every moment of his waking hours, and he lived in his sleep, his subjective mind rioting through his 5 hours of surcease, and combining the thoughts and events of the day into grotesque and impossible marvels. In reality, he never rested, and a weaker body or a less firmly poised brain would have been prostrated in a general breakdown. His late afternoon calls on Ruth were rarer now, for June was approaching, when she would take her degree and finish with the university, Bachelor of Arts. When he thought of her degree, it seemed she fled beyond him faster than he could pursue. One afternoon a week she gave to him, and arriving late, he usually stayed for dinner and for music afterward. Those were his red-letter days. The atmosphere of the house, in such contrast with that in which he lived, and the mere nearness to her, sent him forth each time with a firmer grip on his resolve to climb the heights. In spite of the beauty in him and the aching desire to create, it was for her that he struggled. He was a lover first and always. All other things he subordinated to love. Greater than his adventure in the world of thought was his love adventure. The world itself was not so amazing because of the atoms and molecules that composed it according to the propulsions of irresistible force. What made it amazing was the fact that Ruth lived in it. She was the most amazing thing he had ever known, or dreamed, or guessed. But he was oppressed always by her remoteness. She was so far from him, and he did not know how to approach her. He had been a success with girls and women in his own class, but he had never loved any of them, while he did love her, and besides, she was not merely of another class. His very love elevated her above all classes. She was a being apart, so far apart that he did not know how to draw near to her as a lover should draw near. It was true, as he acquired knowledge and language, that he was drawing nearer, talking her speech, discovering ideas and delights in common. But this did not satisfy his lover's yearning. His lover's imagination had made her holy, too spiritualized, to have any kinship with him in the flesh. It was his own love that thrust her from him, and made her seem impossible for him. Love itself denied him the one thing that it desired. And then, one day, without warning, the gulf between them was bridged for a moment, and thereafter, though the gulf remained, it was ever narrower. They had been eating cherries, great, luscious, black cherries, with a juice the color of dark wine. And later, as she read aloud to him from The Princess, he chanced to notice the stain of the cherries on her lips. For the moment, her divinity was shattered. She was clay, after all, mere clay, subject to the common law of clay as his clay was subject, or anybody's clay. Her lips were flesh like his, and cherries dyed them as cherries dyed his. And if so with her lips, then was it so with all of her. She was woman, all woman, just like any woman. It came upon him abruptly. It was a revelation that stunned him. It was as if he had seen the sun fall out of the sky, or had seen worshipped purity polluted. Then he realized the significance of it, and his heart began pounding and challenging him to play the lover with this woman, who was not a spirit from other worlds, but a mere woman with lips a cherry could stain. He trembled at the audacity of his thought, but all his soul was singing, and reason, in a triumphant paean, assured him he was right. Something of this change in him must have reached her, for she paused from her reading, looked up at him, and smiled. His eyes dropped from her blue eyes to her lips, and the sight of the stain maddened him. His arms all but flashed out to her and around her, in the way of his old careless life. She seemed to lean toward him, to wait, and all his will fought to hold him back. "You were not following a word," she pouted. Then she laughed at him, delighting in his confusion, and as he looked into her frank eyes and knew that she had divined nothing of what he felt, he became abashed. He had indeed, in thought, dared too far. Of all the women he had known, there was no woman who would have not guessed, save her. And she had not guessed. There was the difference. She was different. He was appalled by his own grossness, awed by her clear innocence, and he gazed again at her across the gulf. The bridge had broken down. But still the incident had brought him nearer. The memory of it persisted, and in the moments when he was most cast down, he dwelt upon it eagerly. The gulf was never again so wide. He had accomplished a distance vastly greater than a bachelorship of arts, or a dozen bachelorships. She was pure, it was true, as he had never dreamed of purity, but cherries stained her lips. She was subject to the laws of the universe just as inexorably as he was. She had to eat to live, and when she got her feet wet, she caught cold. But that was not the point. If she could feel hunger and thirst, and heat and cold, then she could feel love, and love for a man. Well, he was a man, and why could he not be the man? "It's up to me to make good," he would murmur fervently. "I will be the man. I will make myself the man. I will make good." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Early one evening, struggling with a sonnet that twisted all awry the beauty and thought that trailed in glow and vapor through his brain, Martin was called to the telephone. "It's a lady's voice, a fine lady's," Mr. Higginbotham, who had called him, jeered. Martin went to the telephone in the corner of the room, and felt a wave of warmth rush through him as he heard Ruth's voice. In his battle with the sonnet, he had forgotten her existence, and at the sound of her voice, his love for her smote him like a sudden blow. And such a voice! Delicate and sweet, like a strain of music heard far off and faint, or better, like a bell of silver, a perfect tone, crystal pure. No mere woman had a voice like that. There was something celestial about it, and it came from other worlds. He could scarcely hear what it said, so ravished was he, though he controlled his face, for he knew that Mr. Higginbotham's ferret eyes were fixed upon him. It was not much that Ruth wanted to say, merely that Norman was going to take her to a lecture that night, but that he had a headache, and she was so disappointed, and she had the tickets, and that if he had no other engagement, would he be good enough to take her? Would he? He fought to suppress the eagerness in his voice. It was amazing. He had always seen her in her own house, and he had never dared to ask her to go anywhere with him. Quite irrelevantly, still at the telephone, and talking with her, he felt an overpowering desire to die for her, and visions of heroic sacrifice shaped and dissolved in his whirling brain. He loved her so much, so terribly, so hopelessly. In that moment of mad happiness, that she would go out with him, go to a lecture with him, Martin Eden, she soared so far above him that there seemed nothing else for him to do than die for her. It was the only fit way in which he could express the tremendous and lofty emotion he felt for her. It was the sublime abnegation of true love that comes to all lovers, and it came to him there, at the telephone, in a whirlwind of fire and glory. And to die for her, he felt, was to have lived and loved well. And he was only 21, and he had never been in love before. His hand trembled as he hung up the receiver, and he was weak from the organ which had stirred him. His eyes were shining like an angel's, and his face was transfigured, purged of all earthly dross, and pure and holy. "Making dates outside, eh?" his brother-in-law sneered. "You know what that means. You'll be in the police court yet." But Martin could not come down from the height. Not even the bestiality of the illusion could bring him back to earth. Anger and hurt were beneath him. He had seen a great vision and was as a god, and he could feel only profound and awful pity for this maggot of a man. He did not look at him, and though his eyes passed over him, he did not see him, and as in a dream he passed out of the room to dress. It was not until he had reached his own room and was tying his necktie that he became aware of a sound that lingered unpleasantly in his ears. On investigating this sound, he identified it as the final snort of Bernard Higginbotham, which somehow had not penetrated to his brain before. As Ruth's front door closed behind him, and he came down the steps with her, he found himself greatly perturbed. It was not unalloyed bliss, taking her to the lecture. He did not know what he ought to do. He had seen, on the streets, with persons of her class, that the women took the men's arms, but then again, he had seen them when they didn't, and he wondered if it was only in the evening that arms were taken, or only between husbands and wives and relatives. Just before he reached the sidewalk, he remembered Minnie. Minnie had always been a stickler. She had called him down the second time she walked out with him, because he had gone along on the inside, and she had laid down the law to him that a gentleman always walked on the outside when he was with a lady. And Minnie had made a practice of kicking his heels whenever they crossed from one side of the street to the other, to remind him to get over on the outside. He wondered where she had got this item of etiquette, and whether it had filtered down from above and was all right. It wouldn't do any harm to try it, he decided, by the time they had reached the sidewalk. And he swung behind Ruth and took up his station on the outside. Then the other problem presented itself. Should he offer his arm? He had never offered anybody his arm in his life. The girls he had known never took the fellow's arms. For the first several times they walked freely, side by side, and after it was arms around the waists and heads against the fellow's shoulders where the streets were unlighted. But this was different. She wasn't that kind of a girl. He must do something. He crooked his arm next to her, crooked it very slightly and with secret tentativeness, not invitingly, but just casually, as though he was accustomed to walk that way. And then the wonderful thing happened. He felt her hand upon his arm. Delicious thrills ran through him at the contact, and for a few sweet moments it seemed that he had left the solid earth and was flying with her through the air. But he was soon back again, perturbed by a new complication. They were crossing the street. This would put him on the inside. He should be on the outside. Should he therefore drop her arm and change over? And if he did so, would he have to repeat the maneuver the next time, and the next? There was something wrong about it, and he resolved not to caper about and play the fool. Yet he was not satisfied with his conclusion, and when he found himself on the inside, he talked quickly and earnestly, making a show of being carried away by what he was saying, so that, in case he was wrong in not changing sides, his enthusiasm would seem the cause for his carelessness. As they crossed Broadway, he came face to face with a new problem. In the blaze of the electric lights, he saw Lizzie Connolly and her giggly friend. Only for an instant he hesitated, then his hand went up and his hat came off. He could not be disloyal to his kind, and it was to more than Lizzie Connolly that his hat was lifted. She nodded and looked at him boldly, not with soft and gentle eyes like Ruth's, but with eyes that were handsome and hard, and that swept on past him to Ruth, and itemized her face and dress and station. And he was aware that Ruth looked too, with quick eyes that were timid and mild as a dove's, but which saw, in a look that was a flutter on and past, the working-class girl in her cheap finery, and under the strange hat that all working-class girls were wearing just then. "What a pretty girl," Ruth said a moment later. Martin could have blessed her, though he said, "I don't know. I guess it's all a matter of personal taste, but she doesn't strike me as being particularly pretty." "Why, there isn't one woman in 10,000 with features as regular as hers. They are splendid. Her face is as clear-cut as a cameo, and her eyes are beautiful." "Do you think so?" Martin queried absently. For to him there was only one beautiful woman in the world, and she was beside him, her hand upon his arm. Do I think so? If that girl had proper opportunity to dress, Mr. Eden, and if she were taught how to carry herself, you would be fairly dazzled by her, and so would all men. She would have to be taught how to speak, he commented, or else most of the men wouldn't understand her. I'm sure you couldn't understand a quarter of what she said if she just spoke naturally. Nonsense! You were just as bad as Arthur when you try to make your point. You forget how I talked when you first met me. I have learned a new language since then. Before that time I talked as that girl talks. Now I can manage to make myself understood sufficiently in your language to explain that you do not know that other girl's language. And do you know why she carries herself the way she does? I think about such things now, though I never used to think about them, and I am beginning to understand much. But why does she? She has worked long hours for years at machines. When one's body is young, it is very pliable, and hard work will mold it like putty, according to the nature of the work. I can tell at a glance the trades of many working men I meet on the street. Look at me. Why am I rolling all about the shop? Because of the years I put in on the sea. If I'd put in the same years cow-punching, with my body young and pliable, I wouldn't be rolling now, but I'd be bow-legged. And so with that girl. You notice that her eyes were what I might call hard. She has never been sheltered. She has had to take care of herself. And a young girl can't take care of herself and keep her eyes soft and gentle like yours, for example. I think you are right, Ruth said in a low voice. And it is too bad. She is such a pretty girl. He looked at her and saw her eyes luminous with pity, and then he remembered that he loved her and was lost in amazement at his fortune that permitted him to love her and to take her on his arm to a lecture. Who are you, Martin Eden? He demanded of himself in the looking-glass, that night when he got back to his room. He gazed at himself long and curiously. Who are you? What are you? Where do you belong? You belong by rights to girls like Lizzie Connolly. You belong with the legions of toil, with all that is low and vulgar and unbeautiful. You belong with the oxen and the drudges, in dirty surroundings among smells and stenches. There are the stale vegetables now. Those potatoes are rotting. Smell them, damn you, smell them. And yet you dare to open the books, to listen to beautiful music, to learn to love beautiful paintings, to speak good English, to think thoughts that none of your own kind thinks, to tear yourself away from the oxen and the Lizzie Connollys, and to love a pale spirit of a woman who is 1,000,000 times beyond you, and who lives in the stars. Who are you, and what are you? Damn you! And are you going to make good? He shook his fist at himself in the glass, and sat down on the edge of the bed to dream for a space with wide eyes. Then he got out notebook and algebra, and lost himself in quadratic equations, while the hours slipped by, and the stars dimmed, and the gray of dawn flooded against his window. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. It was the knot of wordy socialists and working-class philosophers that held forth in the City Hall Park on warm afternoons that was responsible for the great discovery. Once or twice in the month, while riding through the park on his way to the library, Martin dismounted from his wheel and listened to the arguments, and each time he tore himself away reluctantly. The tone of discussion was much lower than at Mr. Morse's table. The men were not grave and dignified. They lost their tempers easily and called one another names, while oaths and obscene allusions were frequent on their lips. Once or twice he had seen them come to blows, and yet he knew not why. There seemed something vital about the stuff of these men's thoughts. Their logomachy was far more stimulating to his intellect than the reserved and quiet dogmatism of Mr. Morse. These men, who slaughtered English, gesticulated like lunatics, and fought one another's ideas with primitive anger, seemed somehow to be more alive than Mr. Morse and his crony, Mr. Butler. Martin had heard Herbert Spencer quoted several times in the park, but one afternoon a disciple of Spencer's appeared, a seedy tramp with a dirty coat buttoned tightly at the throat to conceal the absence of a shirt. Battle royal was waged, amid the smoking of many cigarettes and the expectoration of much tobacco juice, wherein the tramp successfully held his own, even when a socialist workman sneered, "There is no God but the unknowable, and Herbert Spencer is his prophet." Martin was puzzled as to what the discussion was about, but when he rode on to the library he carried with him a newborn interest in Herbert Spencer, and because of the frequency with which the tramp had mentioned First Principles, Martin drew out that volume. So the great discovery began. Once before he had tried Spencer, and choosing the Principles of Psychology to begin with, he had failed as abjectly as he had failed with Madame Blavatsky. There had been no understanding the book, and he had returned it unread. But this night, after algebra and physics, and an attempt at a sonnet, he got into bed and opened First Principles. Morning found him still reading. It was impossible for him to sleep, nor did he write that day. He lay on the bed till his body grew tired, when he tried the hard floor, reading on his back, the book held in the air above him, or changing from side to side. He slept that night, and did his writing next morning, and then the book tempted him. And he fell, reading all afternoon, oblivious to everything, and oblivious to the fact that that was the afternoon Ruth gave to him. His first consciousness of the immediate world about him was when Bernard Higginbotham jerked open the door and demanded to know if he thought they were running a restaurant. Martin Eden had been mastered by curiosity all his days. He wanted to know, and it was this desire that had sent him adventuring over the world. But he was now learning from Spencer that he never had known, and that he never could have known had he continued his sailing and wandering forever. He had merely skimmed over the surface of things, observing detached phenomena, accumulating fragments of facts, making superficial little generalizations, and all and everything quite unrelated in a capricious and disorderly world of whim and chance. The mechanism of the flight of birds he had watched and reasoned about with understanding, but it had never entered his head to try to explain the process whereby birds, as organic flying mechanisms, had been developed. He had never dreamed there was such a process. That birds should have come to be was unguessed. They always had been. They just happened. And as it was with birds, so it had been with everything. His ignorant and unprepared attempts at philosophy had been fruitless. The medieval metaphysics of Kant had given him the key to nothing, and had served the sole purpose of making him doubt his own intellectual powers. In similar manner, his attempt to study evolution had been confined to a hopelessly technical volume by Romanes. He had understood nothing, and the only idea he had gathered was that evolution was a dry-as-dust theory of a lot of little men possessed by huge and unintelligible vocabularies. And now he learned that evolution was no mere theory, but an accepted process of development, that scientists no longer disagreed about it, their only differences being over the method of evolution. And here was the man Spencer, organizing all knowledge for him, reducing everything to unity, elaborating ultimate realities, and presenting to his startled gaze a universe so concrete of realization that it was like the model of a ship such as sailors make and put into glass bottles. There was no caprice, no chance. All was law. It was in obedience to law that the bird flew, and it was in obedience to the same law that fermenting slime had writhed and squirmed, and put out legs and wings and become a bird. Martin had ascended from pitch to pitch of intellectual living, and here he was at a higher pitch than ever. All the hidden things were laying their secrets bare. He was drunken with comprehension. At night, asleep, he lived with the gods in colossal nightmare, and awake in the day, he went about like a somnambulist, with absent stare, gazing over the world he had just discovered. At table he failed to hear the conversation about petty and ignoble things, his eager mind seeking out and following cause and effect in everything before him. In the meat on the platter he saw the shining sun, and traced its energy through all its transformations to its source 100 million miles away, or traced its energy ahead to the moving muscles in his arms that enabled him to cut the meat, and to the brain wherewith he willed the muscles to move to cut the meat, until, with inward gaze, he saw the same sun shining in his brain. He was entranced by illumination, and did not hear the "bug house" whispered by Jim, nor see the anxiety on his sister's face, nor notice the rotary motion of Bernard Higginbotham's finger, whereby he imparted the suggestion of wheels revolving in his brother-in-law's head. What, in a way, most profoundly impressed Martin was the correlation of knowledge, of all knowledge. He had been curious to know things, and whatever he acquired he had filed away in separate memory compartments in his brain. Thus, on the subject of sailing he had an immense store. On the subject of woman he had a fairly large store. But these two subjects had been unrelated. Between the two memory compartments there had been no connection. That, in the fabric of knowledge, there should be any connection whatever between a woman with hysterics and a schooner carrying a weather helm or heaving to in a gale, would have struck him as ridiculous and impossible. But Herbert Spencer had shown him not only that it was not ridiculous, but that it was impossible for there to be no connection. All things were related to all other things, from the farthermost star in the wastes of space to the myriads of atoms in the grain of sand under one's foot. This new concept was a perpetual amazement to Martin, and he found himself engaged continually in tracing the relationship between all things under the sun and on the other side of the sun. He drew up lists of the most incongruous things, and was unhappy until he succeeded in establishing kinship between them all. Kinship between love, poetry, earthquake, fire, rattlesnakes, rainbows, precious gems, monstrosities, sunsets, the roaring of lions, illuminating gas, cannibalism, beauty, murder, lovers, fulcrums, and tobacco. Thus he unified the universe, and held it up and looked at it, or wandered through its byways and alleys and jungles, not as a terrified traveler, in the thick of mysteries, seeking an unknown goal, but observing and charting and becoming familiar with all there was to know. And the more he knew, the more passionately he admired the universe and life, and his own life in the midst of it all. "You fool!" he cried at his image in the looking-glass. "You wanted to write, and you tried to write, and you had nothing in you to write about. What did you have in you? Some childish notions, a few half-baked sentiments, a lot of undigested beauty, a great black mass of ignorance, a heart filled to bursting with love, and an ambition as big as your love and as futile as your ignorance. And you wanted to write. Why, you're just on the edge of beginning to get something in you to write about. You wanted to create beauty, but how could you when you knew nothing about the nature of beauty? You wanted to write about life when you knew nothing of the essential characteristics of life. You wanted to write about the world and the scheme of existence when the world was a Chinese puzzle to you, and all that you could have written would have been about what you did not know of the scheme of existence. But cheer up, Martin, my boy. You'll write yet. You know a little, very little, and you're on the right road now to know more. Some day, if you're lucky, you may come pretty close to knowing all that may be known. Then you will write." He brought his great discovery to Ruth, sharing with her all his joy and wonder in it. But she did not seem to be so enthusiastic over it. She tacitly accepted it and, in a way, seemed aware of it from her own studies. It did not stir her deeply, as it did him, and he would have been surprised, had he not reasoned it out, that it was not new and fresh to her as it was to him. Arthur and Norman, he found, believed in evolution and had read Spencer, though it did not seem to have made any vital impression upon them, while the young fellow with the glasses and the mop of hair, Will Olney, sneered disagreeably at Spencer, and repeated the epigram, "There is no God but the unknowable, and Herbert Spencer is his prophet." But Martin forgave him the sneer, for he had begun to discover that Olney was not in love with Ruth. Later, he was dumbfounded to learn from various little happenings not only that Olney did not care for Ruth, but that he had a positive dislike for her. Martin could not understand this. It was a bit of phenomena that he could not correlate with all the rest of the phenomena in the universe. But nevertheless, he felt sorry for the young fellow, because of the great lack in his nature that prevented him from a proper appreciation of Ruth's fineness and beauty. They rode out into the hills several Sundays on their wheels, and Martin had ample opportunity to observe the armed truce that existed between Ruth and Olney. The latter chummed with Norman, throwing Arthur and Martin into company with Ruth, for which Martin was duly grateful. Those Sundays were great days for Martin, greatest because he was with Ruth, and great also because they were putting him more on a par with the young men of her class. In spite of their long years of disciplined education, he was finding himself their intellectual equal, and the hours spent with them in conversation was so much practice for him in the use of grammar he had studied so hard. He had abandoned the etiquette books, falling back upon observation to show him the right things to do. Except when carried away by his enthusiasm, he was always on guard, keenly watchful of their actions, and learning their little courtesies and refinements of conduct. The fact that Spencer was very little read was for some time a source of surprise to Martin. "Herbert Spencer," said the man at the desk in the library. "Oh yes, a great mind." But the man did not seem to know anything of the content of that great mind. One evening at dinner, when Mr. Butler was there, Martin turned the conversation upon Spencer. Mr. Morse bitterly arraigned the English philosopher's agnosticism, but confessed that he had not read First Principles, while Mr. Butler stated that he had no patience with Spencer, had never read a line of him, and had managed to get along quite well without him. Doubts arose in Martin's mind, and had he been less strongly individual, he would have accepted the general opinion and given Herbert Spencer up. As it was, he found Spencer's explanation of things convincing, and, as he phrased it to himself, to give up Spencer would be equivalent to a navigator throwing the compass and chronometer overboard. So Martin went on into a thorough study of evolution, mastering more and more the subject himself, and being convinced by the corroborative testimony of 1,000 independent writers. The more he studied, the more vistas he caught of fields of knowledge yet unexplored, and the regret that days were only 24 hours long became a chronic complaint with him. One day, because the days were so short, he decided to give up algebra and geometry. Trigonometry he had not even attempted. Then he cut chemistry from his study list, retaining only physics. "I am not a specialist," he said in defense to Ruth, "nor am I going to try to be a specialist. There are too many special fields for any one man, in a whole lifetime, to master a tithe of them. I must pursue general knowledge. When I need the work of specialists, I shall refer to their books." "But that is not like having the knowledge yourself," she protested. "But it is unnecessary to have it. We profit from the work of specialists. That's what they are for. When I came in, I noticed the chimney sweeps at work. They're specialists, and when they get done, you will enjoy clean chimneys without knowing anything about the construction of chimneys." "That's far-fetched, I am afraid." She looked at him curiously, and he felt a reproach in her gaze and manner. But he was convinced of the rightness of his position. All thinkers on general subjects, the greatest minds in the world, in fact, rely on specialists. Herbert Spencer did that. He generalized upon the findings of thousands of investigators. He would have had to live 1,000 lives in order to do it all himself, and so with Darwin. He took advantage of all that had been learned by the florists and cattle breeders. "You're right, Martin," Olney said. "You know what you're after, and Ruth doesn't. She doesn't know what she is after for herself, even." "Oh, yes," Olney rushed on, heading off her objection. "I know you call it general culture, but it doesn't matter what you study if you want general culture. You can study French or you can study German, or cut them both out and study Esperanto. You'll get the culture tone just the same. You can study Greek or Latin, too, for that same purpose. Though it will never be any use to you. It will be culture, though. Why, Ruth studied Saxon, became clever in it. That was 2 years ago, and all she remembers of it now is, "On that sweet April with his showers sweet." Isn't that the way it goes? But it's given you the culture tone just the same, he laughed, again heading her off. I know, we were in the same classes. But you speak of culture as if it was a means to something, Ruth cried out. Her eyes were flashing, and in her cheeks were 2 spots of color. Culture is an end in itself. But that is not what Martin wants. How do you know? What do you want, Martin? Olney demanded, turning squarely upon him. Martin felt very uncomfortable, and he looked entreaty at Ruth. Yes, what do you want? Ruth asked. That will settle it. Yes, of course I want culture, Martin faltered. I love beauty, and culture will give me finer and greater appreciation of beauty. She nodded her head and looked triumphant. Rot, and you know it, was Olney's comment. Martin's after career, not culture. It just happens that culture, in his case, is incidental to career. If he wanted to be a chemist, culture would be unnecessary. Martin wants to write, but he's afraid to say so because it will put you in the wrong. And why does Martin want to write? He went on. Because he isn't rolling in wealth. Why do you fill your head with Saxon and general culture? Because you don't have to make your way in the world. Your father sees to that. He buys your clothes for you, and all the rest. What rotten good is our education, yours and mine and Arthur's and Norman's? We're soaked in general culture, and if our daddies went broke today, we'd be falling down tomorrow on teachers' examinations. The best job you could get, Ruth, would be a country school or music teacher in a girls' boarding school. And pray, what would you do? She asked. Not a blessed thing. I could earn $1.50 a day common labor, and I might get in as an instructor at Hanley's cramming joint. I say I might, mind you, and I might be chucked out at the end of the week for sheer inability. Martin followed the discussion closely, and while he was convinced that Olney was right, he resented the rather cavalier treatment he accorded Ruth. A new conception of love formed in his mind as he listened. Reason had nothing to do with love. It mattered not whether the woman he loved reasoned correctly or incorrectly. Love was above reason. If it just happened that she did not fully appreciate his necessity for a career, that did not make her a bit less lovable. She was all lovable, and what she thought had nothing to do with her lovableness. What's that? He replied to a question from Olney that broke in upon his train of thought. I was saying that I hoped you wouldn't be a fool enough to tackle Latin. But Latin is more than culture, Ruth broke in. It is equipment. Well, are you going to tackle it? Olney persisted. Martin was sore beset. He could see that Ruth was hanging eagerly upon his answer. I am afraid I won't have time, he said finally. I'd like to, but I won't have time. You see, Martin's not seeking culture. Olney exulted. He's trying to get somewhere, to do something. Oh, but it's mental training, it's mind discipline. It's what makes disciplined minds. Ruth looked expectantly at Martin, as if wanting for him to change his judgment. You know, the football players have to train before the big game, and that is what Latin does for the thinker. It trains. Rot and bosh. That's what they told us when we were kids. But there is one thing that they didn't tell us then. They let us find it out for ourselves afterwards. Olney paused for effect, then added, and what they didn't tell us was that every gentleman should have studied Latin, but that no gentleman should know Latin. Now that's unfair, Ruth cried. I knew you were turning the conversation just in order to get off something. It's clever, all right, was the retort, but it's fair, too. The only men who know their Latin are the apothecaries, the lawyers, and the Latin professors. And if Martin wants to be one of them, I miss my guess. But what's all that got to do with Herbert Spencer, anyway? Martin's just discovered Spencer, and he's wild over him. Why? Because Spencer is taking him somewhere. Spencer couldn't take me anywhere, nor you. We haven't got anywhere to go. You'll get married some day, and I'll have nothing to do but keep track of the lawyers and business agents who will take care of the money my father's going to leave me." Olney got up to go, but turned at the door and delivered a parting shot. "You leave Martin alone, Ruth. He knows what's best for himself. Look at what he's done already. He makes me sick sometimes, sick and ashamed of myself. He knows more now about the world and life and man's place and all the rest than Arthur or Norman or I or you, too, for that matter, and in spite of all our Latin and French and Saxon and culture." "But Ruth is my teacher," Martin answered chivalrously. "She is responsible for what little I have learned." "Rats!" Olney looked at Ruth, and his expression was malicious. "I suppose you'll be telling me next that you read Spencer on her recommendation, only you didn't. And she doesn't know anything more about Darwin and evolution than I do about King Solomon's mines. What's that jawbreaker definition about something or other of Spencer's that you sprang on us the other day? That indefinite, incoherent homogeneity thing. Spring it on her, and see if she understands a word of it. That isn't culture, you see. Well, tra-la, if you tackle Latin, Martin, I won't have any respect for you." And all the while, interested in the discussion, Martin had been aware of an irk in it as well. It was about studies and lessons, dealing with the rudiments of knowledge, and the schoolboyish tone of it conflicted with the big things that were stirring in him. With the grip upon life that was even then crooking his fingers like eagle's talons, with the cosmic thrills that made him ache, and with the inchoate consciousness of mastery of it all. He likened himself to a poet, wrecked on the shores of a strange land, filled with power of beauty, stumbling and stammering and vainly trying to sing in the rough barbaric tongue of his brethren in the new land. And so with him. He was alive, painfully alive, to the great universal things, and yet he was compelled to potter and grope among schoolboy topics, and debate whether or not he should study Latin. "What in hell has Latin got to do with it?" he demanded before his mirror that night. "I wish dead people would stay dead. Why should I and the beauty in me be ruled by the dead? Beauty is alive and everlasting. Languages come and go. They are the dust of the dead." And his next thought was that he had been phrasing his ideas very well, and he went to bed wondering why he could not talk in similar fashion when he was with Ruth. He was only a schoolboy, with a schoolboy's tongue, when he was in her presence. "Give me time," he said aloud. "Only give me time." Time, time, time was his unending plaint. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. It was not because of Olney, but in spite of Ruth, and his love for Ruth, that he finally decided not to take up Latin. His money meant time. There was so much that was more important than Latin, so many studies that clamored with imperious voices. And he must write. He must earn money. He had had no acceptances. 200 of manuscripts were traveling the endless round of the magazines. How did the others do it? He spent long hours in the free reading room, going over what others had written, studying their work eagerly and critically, comparing it with his own, and wondering about the secret trick they had discovered which enabled them to sell their work. He was amazed at the immense amount of printed stuff that was dead. No light, no life, no color was shot through it. There was no breath of life in it, and yet it sold, at 2 cents a word, $20 1,000. The newspaper clipping had said so. He was puzzled by the countless short stories, written lightly and cleverly, he confessed, but without vitality or reality. Life was so strange and wonderful, filled with an immensity of problems, of dreams, and of heroic toils, and yet these stories dealt only with the commonplaces of life. He felt the stress and strain of life, its fevers and sweats, and wild insurgences. Surely this was the stuff to write about. He wanted to glorify the leaders of forlorn hopes, the mad lovers, the giants that fought under stress and strain, amid terror and tragedy, making life crackle with the strength of their endeavor. And yet the magazine short stories seemed intent on glorifying the Mr. Butlers, the sordid dollar chasers, and the commonplace little love affairs of commonplace little men and women. Was it because the editors of the magazines were commonplace, he demanded, or were they afraid of life, these writers and editors and readers? But his chief trouble was that he did not know any editors or writers. And not merely did he not know any writers, but he did not know anybody who had ever attempted to write. There was nobody to tell him, to hint to him, to give him the least word of advice. He began to doubt that editors were real men. They seemed cogs in a machine. That was what it was, a machine. He poured his soul into stories, articles, and poems, and entrusted them to the machine. He folded them just so, put the proper stamps inside the long envelope along with the manuscript, sealed the envelope, put more stamps outside, and dropped it into the mailbox. It traveled across the continent, and after a certain lapse of time, the postman returned him the manuscript in another long envelope, on the outside of which were the stamps he had enclosed. There was no human editor at the other end, but a mere cunning arrangement of cogs that changed the manuscript from one envelope to another, and stuck on the stamps. It was like the slot machines wherein one dropped pennies, and, with a metallic whirl of machinery, had delivered to him a stick of chewing gum or a tablet of chocolate. It depended upon which slot one dropped the penny in, whether he got chocolate or gum. And so with the editorial machine. One slot brought checks, and the other brought rejection slips. So far he had found only the latter slot. It was the rejection slips that completed the horrible machine-likeness of the process. These slips were printed in stereotyped forms, and he had received hundreds of them, as many as a dozen or more, on each of his earlier manuscripts. If he had received one line, one personal line, along with one rejection of all his rejections, he would have been cheered. But not one editor had given that proof of existence, and he could conclude only that there were no warm human men at the other end, only mere cogs, well-oiled and running beautifully in the machine. He was a good fighter, whole-souled and stubborn, and he would have been content to continue feeding the machine for years, but he was bleeding to death, and not years but weeks would determine the fight. Each week his board bill brought him nearer destruction, while the postage on 40 manuscripts bled him almost as severely. He no longer bought books, and he economized in petty ways, and sought to delay the inevitable end, though he did not know how to economize, and brought the end nearer by a week when he gave his sister Marian $5 for a dress. He struggled in the dark, without advice, without encouragement, and in the teeth of discouragement. Even Gertrude was beginning to look askance. At first she had tolerated with sisterly fondness what she conceived to be his foolishness, but now, out of sisterly solicitude, she grew anxious. To her it seemed that his foolishness was becoming a madness. Martin knew this, and suffered more keenly from it than from the open and nagging contempt of Bernard Higginbotham. Martin had faith in himself, but he was alone in this faith. Not even Ruth had faith. She had wanted him to devote himself to study, and, though she had not openly disapproved of his writing, she had never approved. He had never offered to show her his work. A fastidious delicacy had prevented him. Besides, she had been studying heavily at the university, and he felt averse to robbing her of her time. But when she had taken her degree, she asked him herself to let her see something of what he had been doing. Martin was elated and diffident. Here was a judge. She was a bachelor of arts. She had studied literature under skilled instructors. Perhaps the editors were capable judges, too. But she would be different from them. She would not hand him a stereotyped rejection slip, nor would she inform him that lack of preference for his work did not necessarily imply lack of merit in his work. She would talk, a warm human being, in her quick, bright way, and, most important of all, she would catch glimpses of the real Martin Eden. In his work she would discern what his heart and soul were like, and she would come to understand something, a little something, of the stuff of his dreams and the strength of his power. Martin gathered together a number of carbon copies of his short stories, hesitated a moment, then added his sea lyrics. They mounted their wheels on a late June afternoon and rode for the hills. It was the second time he had been out with her alone, and as they rode along through the balmy warmth, just chilled by the sea breeze to refreshing coolness, he was profoundly impressed by the fact that it was a very beautiful and well-ordered world, and that it was good to be alive and to love. They left their wheels by the roadside and climbed to the brown top of an open knoll, where the sunburnt grass breathed a harvest breath of dry sweetness and content. "Its work is done," Martin said, as they seated themselves, she upon his coat, and he sprawling close to the warm earth. He sniffed the sweetness of the tawny grass, which entered his brain, and set his thoughts whirling on, from the particular to the universe. "It has achieved its reason for existence," he went on, patting the dry grass affectionately. "It quickened with ambition under the dreary downpour of last winter, fought the violent early spring, flowered, and lured the insects and the bees, scattered its seeds, squared itself with its duty and the world, and—" "Why do you always look at things with such dreadfully practical eyes?" she interrupted. "Because I've been studying evolution, I guess. It's only recently that I got my eyesight, if truth were told. But it seems to me you lose sight of beauty by being so practical, that you destroy beauty like the boys who catch butterflies and rub the down off their beautiful wings." He shook his head. "Beauty has significance, but I never knew its significance before. I just accepted beauty as something meaningless, as something that was just beautiful without rhyme or reason. I did not know anything about beauty, but now I know, or rather, am just beginning to know. This grass is more beautiful to me now that I know why it is grass, and all the hidden chemistry of sun and rain and earth that makes it become grass. Why, there is romance in the life history of any grass, yes, and adventure too. The very thought of it stirs me. When I think of the play of force and matter, and all the tremendous struggle of it, I feel as if I could write an epic on the grass." "How well you talk," she said absently, and he noted that she was looking at him in a searching way. He was all confusion and embarrassment on the instant, the blood rushing red on his neck and brow. "I hope I am learning to talk," he stammered. "There seems to be so much in me I want to say, but it is all so big. I can't find ways to say what is really in me. Sometimes it seems to me that all the world, all life, everything, has taken up residence inside of me, and was clamoring for me to be the spokesman. I feel, I can't describe it. I feel the bigness of it, but when I speak, I babble like a little child. It is a great task to transmute feeling and sensation into speech, written or spoken, that will in turn, in him who reads or listens, transmute itself back into the self-same feeling and sensation. It is a lordly task. See, I bury my face in the grass, and the breath I draw in my nostrils sets me quivering with 1,000 thoughts and fancies. It is a breath of the universe I have breathed. I know song and laughter, and success and pain, and struggle and death, and I see visions that arise in my brain somehow out of the scent of the grass, and I would like to tell them to you, to the world, but how can I? My tongue is tied. I have tried, by the spoken word just now, to describe to you the effect on me of the scent of the grass, but I have not succeeded. I have no more than hinted in awkward speech. My words seem gibberish to me, and yet I am stifled with desire to tell. Oh, he threw up his hands with a despairing gesture. It is impossible. It is not understandable. It is incommunicable. But you do talk well, she insisted. Just think how you have improved in the short time I have known you. Mr. Butler is a noted public speaker. He is always asked by the State Committee to go out on stump during campaign. Yet you talked just as well as he the other night at dinner, only he was more controlled. You get too excited. But you will get over that with practice. Why, you would make a good public speaker. You can go far, if you want to. You are masterly. You can lead men, I am sure. And there is no reason why you should not succeed at anything you set your hand to. Just as you have succeeded with grammar. You would make a good lawyer. You should shine in politics. There is nothing to prevent you from making as great a success as Mr. Butler has made, and minus the dyspepsia, she added with a smile. They talked on, she, in her gently persistent way, returning always to the need of thorough grounding in education, and to the advantages of Latin as part of the foundation for any career. She drew her ideal of the successful man, and it was largely in her father's image, with a few unmistakable lines and touches of color from the image of Mr. Butler. He listened eagerly, with receptive ears lying on his back and looking up and joying in each movement of her lips as she talked. But his brain was not receptive. There was nothing alluring in the picture she drew, and he was aware of a dull pain of disappointment and of a sharper ache of love for her. In all she said there was no mention of his writing, and the manuscripts he had brought to read lay neglected on the ground. At last, in a pause, he glanced at the sun, measured its height above the horizon, and suggested his manuscripts by picking them up. "I had forgotten," she said quickly, "and I am so anxious to hear." He read to her a story, one that he flattered himself was among his very best. He called it The Wine of Life, and the wine of it that had stolen into his brain when he wrote it, stole into his brain now as he read it. There was a certain magic in the original conception, and he had adorned it with more magic of phrase and touch. All the old fire and passion with which he had written it were reborn in him, and he was swayed and swept away, so that he was blind and deaf to the faults of it. But he was not so with Ruth. Her trained ear detected the weaknesses and exaggerations, the over-emphasis of the tyro, and she was instantly aware each time the sentence rhythm tripped and faltered. She scarcely noted the rhythm otherwise, except when it became too pompous, at which moments she was disagreeably impressed with its amateurishness. That was her final judgment on the story as a whole, amateurish, though she did not tell him so. Instead, when he had done, she pointed out the minor flaws and said that she liked the story. But he was disappointed. Her criticism was just, he acknowledged that, and he had a feeling that he was not sharing his work with her for the purpose of schoolroom correction. The details did not matter. They could take care of themselves. He would mend them, he would learn to mend them. Out of life he had captured something big and attempted to imprison it in the story. It was the big thing out of life he had read to her, not sentence structure and semicolons. He wanted her to feel with him this big thing that was his, that he had seen with his own eyes, grappled with his own brain, and placed there on the page with his own hands in printed words. Well, he had failed, was his secret decision. Perhaps the editors were right. He had felt the big thing, but he had failed to transmute it. He concealed his disappointment, and joined so easily with her in her criticism that she did not realize that deep down in him was running a strong undercurrent of disagreement. "This next thing I've called The Pot," he said, unfolding the manuscript. "It has been refused by 4 or 5 magazines now, but still I think it is good. In fact, I don't know what to think of it, except that I've caught something there. Maybe it won't affect you as it does me. It's a short thing, only 2,000 words. "How dreadful!" she cried when he had finished. "It is horrible, unutterably horrible." He noted her pale face, her eyes wide and tense, and her clenched hands, with secret satisfaction. He had succeeded. He had communicated the stuff of fancy and feeling from out of his brain. It had struck home. No matter whether she liked it or not, it had gripped her and mastered her, made her sit there and listen and forget details. "It is life," he said, "and life is not always beautiful. And yet, perhaps because I am strangely made, I find something beautiful there. It seems to me that the beauty is tenfold enhanced because it is there." "But why couldn't the poor woman—" She broke in disconnectedly. Then she left the revolt of her thought unexpressed to cry out, "Oh, it is degrading! It is not nice! It is nasty!" For the moment it seemed to him that his heart stood still. Nasty! He had never dreamed it. He had not meant it. The whole sketch stood before him in letters of fire, and in such blaze of illumination he sought vainly for nastiness. Then his heart began to beat again. He was not guilty. "Why didn't you select a nice subject?" she was saying. "We know there are nasty things in the world, but that is no reason." She talked on in her indignant strain, but he was not following her. He was smiling to himself. As he looked up into her virginal face, so innocent, so penetratingly innocent, that its purity seemed always to enter into him, driving out of him all dross and bathing him in some ethereal effulgence that was as cool and soft and velvety as starshine. "We know there are nasty things in the world." He cuddled to him the notion of her knowing, and chuckled over it as a love joke. The next moment, in a flashing vision of multitudinous detail, he sighted the whole sea of life's nastiness that he had known and voyaged over and through, and he forgave her for not understanding the story. It was through no fault of hers that she could not understand. He thanked God that she had been born and sheltered to such innocence. But he knew life, its foulness as well as its fairness, its greatness in spite of the slime that infested it, and by God, he was going to have his say on it to the world. Saints in heaven, how could they be anything but fair and pure? No praise to them. But saints in slime, ah, that was the everlasting wonder. That was what made life worth while. To see moral grandeur rising out of cesspools of iniquity, to rise himself and first glimpse beauty, faint and far, through mud-dripping eyes, to see out of weakness and frailty and viciousness, and all abysmal brutishness, a rising strength and truth, and high spiritual endowment. He caught a stray sequence of sentences she was uttering. "The tone of it is all low, and there is so much that is high. Take In Memoriam." He was impelled to suggest Locksley Hall, and would have done so, had not his vision gripped him again and left him staring at her, the female of his kind who, out of the primordial ferment, creeping and crawling up the vast ladder of life for 1,000,000 centuries, had emerged on the topmost rung, having become one Ruth, pure and fair and divine, and with power to make him know love, and to aspire toward purity, and to desire to taste divinity, him, Martin Eden, who, too, had come up in some amazing fashion from out of the ruck and the mire, and the countless mistakes and abortions of unending creation. There was the romance, and the wonder, and the glory. There was the stuff to write, if he could only find speech. Saints in heaven! They were only saints and could not help themselves, but he was a man. "You have strength," he could hear her saying, "but it is untutored strength. Like a bull in a china shop," he suggested, and won a smile. "And you must develop discrimination. You must consult taste and fineness and tone." "I dare too much," he muttered. She smiled approbation, and settled herself to listen to another story. "I don't know what you'll make of this," he said apologetically. "It's a funny thing. I'm afraid I got beyond my depth in it, but my intentions were good. Don't bother about the little features of it. Just see if you can catch the feel of the big thing in it. It is big, and it is true, though the chance is large that I have failed to make it intelligible." He read, and as he read he watched her. At last he had reached her, he thought. She sat without movement, her eyes steadfast upon him, scarcely breathing, caught up and out of herself, he thought, by the witchery of the thing he had created. He had entitled the story Adventure, and it was the apotheosis of adventure, not of the adventure of the storybooks, but of real adventure. The savage taskmaster, awful of punishment and awful of reward, faithless and whimsical, demanding terrible patience and heartbreaking days and nights of toil, offering the blazing sunlight glory or dark death at the end of thirst and famine, or of the long drag and monstrous delirium of rotting fever. Through blood and sweat and stinging insects, leading up by long chains of petty and ignoble contacts, to royal culminations and lordly achievements. It was this, all of it and more, that he put into his story, and it was this, he believed, that warmed her as she sat and listened. Her eyes were wide, color was in her pale cheeks, and before he finished it seemed to him that she was almost panting. Truly, she was warmed, but she was warmed not by the story, but by him. She did not think much of the story. It was Martin's intensity of power, the old excess of strength, that seemed to pour from his body and on and over her. The paradox of it was that it was the story itself that was freighted with his power. That was the channel, for the time being, through which his strength poured out to her. She was aware only of the strength and not of the medium, and when she seemed most carried away by what he had written, in reality she had been carried away by something quite foreign to it, by a thought, terrible and perilous, that had formed itself unsummoned in her brain. She had caught herself wondering what marriage was like, and the becoming conscious of the waywardness and ardor of the thought had terrified her. It was unmaidenly. It was not like her. She had never been tormented by womanhood, and she had lived in a dreamland of Tennysonian poesy, dense even to the full significance of that delicate master's delicate allusions to the grossnesses that intrude upon the relations of queens and knights. She had been asleep always, and now life was thundering imperatively at all her doors. Mentally, she was in a panic to shoot the bolts and drop the bars into place, while wanton instincts urged her to throw wide her portals and bid the deliciously strange visitor to enter in. Martin waited with satisfaction for her verdict. He had no doubt of what it would be, and he was astounded when he heard her say, "It is beautiful. It is beautiful," she repeated with emphasis after a pause. Of course it was beautiful, but there was something more than mere beauty in it, something more stingingly splendid, which had made beauty its handmaiden. He sprawled silently on the ground, watching the grisly form of a great doubt rising before him. He had failed. He was inarticulate. He had seen one of the greatest things in the world, and he had not expressed it. "What do you think of the—" He hesitated, abashed at his first attempt to use a strange word. "Of the motif?" he asked. "It was confused," she answered. "That is my only criticism in the large way. I followed the story, but there seemed so much else. It is too wordy. You clog the action by introducing so much extraneous material." "That was the major motif," he hurriedly explained. "The big underrunning motif, the cosmic and universal thing. I tried to make it keep time with the story itself, which was only superficial after all. I was on the right scent, but I guess I did badly. I did not succeed in suggesting what I was driving at, but I'll learn in time." She did not follow him. She was a bachelor of arts, but he had gone beyond her limitations. This she did not comprehend, attributing her incomprehension to his incoherence. "You were too voluble," she said, "but it was beautiful in places." He heard her voice as from far off, for he was debating whether he would read her the sea lyrics. He lay in dull despair, while she watched him searchingly, pondering again upon unsummoned and wayward thoughts of marriage. "You want to be famous?" she asked abruptly. "Yes, a little bit," he confessed. "That is part of the adventure. It is not the being famous, but the process of becoming so that counts. And after all, to be famous would be, for me, only a means to something else. I want to be famous very much, for that matter, and for that reason. For your sake," he wanted to add, and might have added, had she proved enthusiastic over what he had read to her. But she was too busy in her mind, carving out a career for him that would at least be possible, to ask what the ultimate something was which he had hinted at. There was no career for him in literature, of that she was convinced. He had proved it today with his amateurish and sophomoric productions. He could talk well, but he was incapable of expressing himself in a literary way. She compared Tennyson and Browning and her favorite prose masters with him, and to his hopeless discredit. Yet she did not tell him her whole mind. Her strange interest in him led her to temporize. His desire to write was, after all, a little weakness, which he would grow out of in time. Then he would devote himself to the more serious affairs of life, and he would succeed, too. She knew that. He was so strong that he could not fail, if only he would drop writing. "I wish you would show me all you write, Mr. Eden," she said. He flushed with pleasure. She was interested, that much was sure. And at least she had not given him a rejection slip. She had called certain portions of his work beautiful, and that was the first encouragement he had ever received from anyone. "I will," he said passionately, "and I promise you, Miss Morse, that I will make good. I have come far, I know that, and I have far to go, and I will cover it if I have to do it on my hands and knees." He held up a bunch of manuscript. "Here are the sea lyrics. When you get home, I'll turn them over to you to read at your leisure. And you must be sure to tell me just what you think of them. What I need, you know, above all things is criticism, and do please be frank with me." "I will be perfectly frank," she promised, with an uneasy conviction that she had not been frank with him, and with a doubt if she could be quite frank with him the next time. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The first battle, fought and finished, Martin said to the looking-glass 10 days later. But there will be a second battle, and a third battle, and battles to the end of time, unless— He had not finished the sentence, but looked about the mean little room, and let his eyes dwell sadly upon a heap of returned manuscripts, still in their long envelopes, which lay in a corner on the floor. He had no stamps with which to continue them on their travels, and for a week they had been piling up. More of them would come in on the morrow, and on the next day, and the next, till they were all in. And he would be unable to start them out again. He was a month's rent behind on the typewriter, which he could not pay, having barely enough for the week's board, which was due, and for the employment office fees. He sat down and regarded the table thoughtfully. There were ink stains upon it, and he suddenly discovered that he was fond of it. "Dear old table," he said, "I've spent some happy hours with you, and you've been a pretty good friend when all is said and done. You never turned me down, never passed me out a reward of unmerit rejection slip, never complained about working overtime." He dropped his arms upon the table and buried his face in them. His throat was aching, and he wanted to cry. It reminded him of his first fight, when he was 6 years old, when he punched away with the tears running down his cheeks, while the other boy, 2 years older, had beaten and pounded him into exhaustion. He saw the ring of boys, howling like barbarians, as he went down at last, writhing in the throes of nausea, the blood streaming from his nose and the tears from his bruised eyes. "Poor little shaver," he murmured, "and you're just as badly licked now. You're beaten to a pulp. You're down and out." But the vision of that first fight still lingered under his eyelids, and as he watched, he saw it dissolve and reshape into the series of fights which had followed. 6 months later, Cheese Face, that was the boy, had whipped him again. but he had blacked Cheeseface's eye that time. That was going some. He saw them all, fight after fight, himself always whipped, and Cheeseface exulting over him. But he had never run away. He felt strengthened by the memory of that. He had always stayed and taken his medicine. Cheeseface had been a little fiend at fighting, and had never once shown mercy to him. But he had stayed. He had stayed with it. Next, he saw a narrow alley between ramshackle frame buildings. The end of the alley was blocked by a one-story brick building, out of which issued the rhythmic thunder of the presses, running off the first edition of the Enquirer. He was 11, and Cheeseface was 13, and they both carried the Enquirer. That was why they were there, waiting for their papers. And, of course, Cheeseface had picked on him again, and there was another fight that was indeterminate, because at 3:45 the door of the press room was thrown open, and the gang of boys crowded in to fold their papers. "I'll lick you tomorrow," he heard Cheeseface promise, and he heard his own voice, piping and trembling with unshed tears, agreeing to be there on the morrow. And he had come there the next day, hurrying from school to be there first, and beating Cheeseface by 2 minutes. The other boys said he was all right, and gave him advice, pointing out his faults as a scrapper, and promising him victory if he carried out their instructions. The same boys gave Cheeseface advice too, how they had enjoyed the fight. He paused in his recollections long enough to envy them the spectacle he and Cheeseface had put up. Then the fight was on, and it went on without rounds for 30 minutes, until the press-room door was opened. He watched the youthful apparition of himself, day after day, hurrying from school to the Enquirer alley. He could not walk very fast. He was stiff and lame from the incessant fighting. His forearms were black and blue from wrist to elbow, what of the countless blows he had warded off, and here and there the tortured flesh was beginning to fester. His head and arms and shoulders ached, the small of his back ached, he ached all over, and his brain was heavy and dazed. He did not play at school, nor did he study. Even to sit still all day at his desk, as he did, was a torment. It seemed centuries since he had begun the round of daily fights, and time stretched away into a nightmare and infinite future of daily fights. Why couldn't Cheeseface be licked, he often thought. That would put him, Martin, out of his misery. It never entered his head to cease fighting, to allow Cheeseface to whip him. And so he dragged himself to the Enquirer alley, sick in body and soul, but learning the long patience to confront the eternal enemy, Cheeseface, who was just as sick as he, and just a bit willing to quit if it were not for the gang of newsboys that looked on and made pride painful and necessary. One afternoon, after 20 minutes of desperate efforts to annihilate each other, according to set rules that did not permit kicking, striking below the belt, nor hitting when one was down, Cheeseface, panting for breath and reeling, offered to call it quits. And Martin, head on arms, thrilled at the picture he caught of himself, at that moment in the afternoon of long ago, when he reeled and panted and choked, with the blood that ran into his mouth and down his throat from his cut lips, when he tottered toward Cheeseface, spitting out a mouthful of blood so that he could speak, crying out that he would never quit, though Cheeseface could give in if he wanted to. And Cheeseface did not give in, and the fight went on. The next day, and the next, days without end, witnessed the afternoon fight. When he put up his arms each day to begin, they pained exquisitely, and the first few blows, struck and received, racked his soul. After that, things grew numb, and he fought on blindly, seeing as in a dream, dancing and wavering, the large features and burning, animal-like eyes of Cheeseface. He concentrated upon that face. All else about him was a whirling void. There was nothing else in the world but that face, and he would never know rest, blessed rest, until he had beaten that face into a pulp with his bleeding knuckles, or until the bleeding knuckles that somehow belonged to that face had beaten him into a pulp. And then, one way or the other, he would have rest. But to quit, for him, Martin, to quit, that was impossible. Came the day when he dragged himself into the Enquirer alley, and there was no Cheese-Face. Nor did Cheese-Face come. The boys congratulated him, and told him that he had licked Cheese-Face. But Martin was not satisfied. He had not licked Cheese-Face, nor had Cheese-Face licked him. The problem had not been solved. It was not until afterward that they learned that Cheese-Face's father had died suddenly that very day. Martin skipped on through the years, to the night in the nigger heaven at the auditorium. He was 17 and just back from sea. A row started. Somebody was bullying somebody, and Martin interfered, to be confronted by Cheese-Face's blazing eyes. "I'll fix you after the show," his ancient enemy hissed. Martin nodded. The nigger heaven bouncer was making his way toward the disturbance. "I'll meet you outside, after the last act," Martin whispered, the while his face showed undivided interest in the buck and wing dancing on the stage. The bouncer glared and went away. "Got a gang?" he asked Cheese-Face at the end of the act. "Sure." "Then I got to get one," Martin announced. Between the acts he mustered his following: 3 fellows he knew from the nail works, a railroad fireman, and half a dozen of the Boo gang, along with as many more from the dread 18 and Market gang. When the theater let out, the 2 gangs strung along inconspicuously on opposite sides of the street. When they came to a quiet corner, they united and held a council of war. 8th Street Bridge is the place," said a red-headed fellow belonging to Cheese-Face's gang. "You can fight in the middle, under the electric light, and whichever way the bulls come in, we can sneak the other way." "That's agreeable to me," Martin said, after consulting with the leaders of his own gang. The 8th Street Bridge, crossing an arm of San Antonio estuary, was the length of 3 city blocks. In the middle of the bridge, and at each end, were electric lights. No policeman could pass those end lights unseen. It was the safe place for the battle that revived itself under Martin's eyelids. He saw the 2 gangs, aggressive and sullen, rigidly keeping apart from each other, and backing their respective champions. And he saw himself and Cheese-Face stripping. A short distance away lookouts were set, their task being to watch the lighted ends of the bridge. A member of the Boo gang held Martin's coat and shirt and cap, ready to race with them into safety in case the police interfered. Martin watched himself go into the center, facing Cheese-Face, and he heard himself say, as he held up his hand warningly, "They ain't no handshaking in this, understand? They ain't nothing but scrap. No throwing up the sponge. This is a grudge fight, and it's to the finish, understand? Somebody's going to get licked." Cheese-Face wanted to demur. Martin could see that. But Cheese-Face's old perilous pride was touched before the 2 gangs. "Aw, come on," he replied. "What's the good of chewing the rag about? I'm with you to the finish." Then they fell upon each other like young bulls, in all the glory of youth, with naked fists, with hatred, with desire to hurt, to maim, to destroy. All the painful 1,000 years' gains of man, in his upward climb through creation, were lost. Only the electric light remained, a milestone on the path of the great human adventure. Martin and Cheese-Face were 2 savages, of the Stone Age, of the squatting place and the tree refuge. They sank lower and lower into the muddy abyss, back into the dregs of the raw beginnings of life, striving blindly and chemically, as atoms strive, as the stardust of the heavens strives, colliding, recoiling, and colliding again and eternally again. "God, we are animals, brute beasts," Martin muttered aloud, as he watched the progress of the fight. It was to him, with his splendid power of vision, like gazing into a kinetoscope. He was both onlooker and participant. His long months of culture and refinement shuddered at the sight. Then the present was blotted out of his consciousness, and the ghosts of the past possessed him, and he was Martin Eden, just returned from sea, and fighting Cheeseface on the 8th Street Bridge. He suffered and toiled and sweated and bled, and exulted when his naked knuckles smashed home. They were twin whirlwinds of hatred, revolving about each other monstrously. The time passed, and the two hostile gangs became very quiet. They had never witnessed such intensity of ferocity, and they were awed by it. The two fighters were greater brutes than they. The first splendid velvet edge of youth and condition wore off, and they fought more cautiously and deliberately. There had been no advantage gained either way. "It's anybody's fight," Martin heard someone saying. Then he followed up a feint right and left, was fiercely countered, and felt his cheek laid open to the bone. No bare knuckle had done that. He heard mutters of amazement at the ghastly damage wrought, and was drenched with his own blood. But he gave no sign. He became immensely wary, for he was wise with knowledge of the low cunning and foul vileness of his kind. He watched and waited, until he feigned a wild rush, which he stopped midway, for he had seen the glint of metal. "Hold up your hand," he screamed. "Them's brass knuckles, and you hit me with 'em." Both gangs surged forward, growling and snarling. In a second there would be a free-for-all fight, and he would be robbed of his vengeance. He was beside himself. "You guys keep out," he screamed hoarsely. "Understand? Say, do you understand?" They shrank away from him. They were brutes, but he was the arch-brute, a thing of terror that towered over them and dominated them. "This is my scrap, and they ain't going to be no buttin' in. Gimme them knuckles." Cheeseface, sobered and a bit frightened, surrendered the foul weapon. "You passed him to him, you redhead sneaking in behind the push there," Martin went on, as he tossed the knuckles into the water. "I seen you, and I was wonderin' what you was up to. If you try anything like that again, I'll beat you to death, understand?" They fought on, through exhaustion and beyond, to exhaustion immeasurable and inconceivable, until the crowd of brutes, its bloodlust sated, terrified by what it saw, begged them impartially to cease. And Cheeseface, ready to drop and die, or to stay on his legs and die, a grisly monster, out of whose features all likeness to Cheeseface had been beaten, wavered and hesitated. But Martin sprang in and smashed him again and again. Next, after a seeming century or so, with Cheeseface weakening fast, in a mix-up of blows, there was a loud snap, and Martin's right arm dropped to his side. It was a broken bone. Everybody heard it and knew, and Cheeseface knew, rushing like a tiger in the other's extremity, and raining blow on blow. Martin's gang surged forward to interfere. Dazed by the rapid succession of blows, Martin warned them back with vile and earnest curses, sobbed out and groaned, in ultimate desolation and despair. He punched on, with his left hand only, and as he punched, doggedly, only half conscious, as from a remote distance he heard murmurs of fear in the gangs, and one said, with shaking voice, "This ain't scrap, fellows. It's murder, and we ought to stop it." But no one stopped it, and he was glad, punching on wearily and endlessly with his one arm, battering away at a bloody something before him that was not a face but a horror, an oscillating, hideous, gibbering, nameless thing that persisted before his wavering vision and would not go away. And he punched on and on, slower and slower, as the last shreds of vitality oozed from him, through centuries and eons and enormous lapses of time, until, in a dim way, he became aware that the nameless thing was sinking, slowly sinking down, to the rough board planking of the bridge. And the next moment he was standing over it, staggering and swaying on shaky legs, clutching at the air for support, and saying in a voice he did not recognize, "Do you want any more? Say, do you want any more?" He was still saying it over and over, demanding, entreating, threatening, to know if it wanted any more. When he felt the fellows of his gang laying hands on him, patting him on the back, and trying to put his coat on him. And then came a sudden rush of blackness and oblivion. The 10 alarm clock on the table ticked on, but Martin Eden, his face buried in his arms, did not hear it. He heard nothing. He did not think. So absolutely had he relived life that he had fainted just as he had fainted years before on the 8th Street Bridge. For a full minute the blackness and the blankness endured. Then, like one from the dead, he sprang upright, eyes flaming, sweat pouring down his face, shouting, "I licked you, Cheeseface. It took me 11 years, but I licked you." His knees were trembling under him. He felt faint, and he staggered back to the bed, sinking down and sitting on the edge of it. He was still in the clutch of the past. He looked about the room, perplexed, alarmed, wondering where he was, until he caught sight of the pile of manuscripts in the corner. Then the wheels of memory slipped ahead through 4 years of time, and he was aware of the present, of the books he had opened and the universe he had won from their pages, of his dreams and ambitions, and of his love for a pale wraith of a girl, sensitive and sheltered and ethereal, who would die of horror did she witness but one moment of what he had just lived through, one moment of all the muck of his life through which he had waded. He arose to his feet and confronted himself in the looking-glass. "And so you rise from the mud, Martin Eden," he said solemnly, "and you cleanse your eyes in a great brightness, and thrust your shoulders among the stars, doing what all life has done, letting the ape and tiger die, and wresting highest heritage from all powers that be." He looked more closely at himself and laughed. "A bit of hysteria and melodrama, eh?" he queried. "Well, never mind. You licked Cheeseface, and you'll lick the editors if it takes twice 11 years to do it in. You can't stop here. You've got to go on. It's to a finish, you know." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The alarm clock went off, jerking Martin out of sleep with a suddenness that would have given headache to one with less splendid constitution. Though he slept soundly, he awoke instantly, like a cat, and he awoke eagerly, glad that the 5 hours of unconsciousness were gone. He hated the oblivion of sleep. There was too much to do, too much of life to live. He grudged every moment of life sleep robbed him of, and before the clock had ceased its clattering, he was head and ears in the wash-basin, and thrilling to the cold bite of the water. But he did not follow his regular program. There was no unfinished story waiting his hand, no new story demanding articulation. He had studied late, and it was nearly time for breakfast. He tried to read a chapter in Fisk, but his brain was restless, and he closed the book. Today witnessed the beginning of the new battle, wherein for some time there would be no writing. He was aware of a sadness akin to that with which one leaves home and family. He looked at the manuscripts in the corner. That was it. He was going away from them, his pitiful, dishonored children that were welcome nowhere. He went over and began to rummage among them, reading snatches here and there, his favorite portions. The Pot he honored with reading aloud, as he did Adventure. Joy, his latest born, completed the day before and tossed into the corner for lack of stamps, won his keenest approbation. "I can't understand," he murmured. "Or maybe it's the editors who can't understand. There's nothing wrong with that. They publish worse every month. Everything they publish is worse. Nearly everything, anyway." After breakfast, he put the typewriter in its case and carried it down into Oakland. "I owe a month on it," he told the clerk in the store. But you tell the manager I'm going to work, and that I'll be in a month or so to straighten up." He crossed on the ferry to San Francisco and made his way to an employment office. Any kind of work, no trade, he told the agent, and was interrupted by a newcomer, dressed rather foppishly, as some working men dress who have instincts for finer things. The agent shook his head despondently. "Nothing doing, eh?" said the other. "Well, I got to get somebody today." He turned and stared at Martin, and Martin, staring back, noted the puffed and discolored face, handsome and weak, and knew that he had been making a night of it. "Looking for a job?" the other queried. "What can you do?" "Hard labor, sailorizing, run a typewriter. No shorthand, can sit on a horse, willing to do anything and tackle anything," was the answer. The other nodded. "Sounds good to me. My name's Dawson, Joe Dawson, and I'm trying to scare up a laundryman." "Too much for me." Martin caught an amusing glimpse of himself ironing fluffy white things that women wear. But he had taken a liking to the other, and he added, "I might do the plain washing. I learned that much at sea." Joe Dawson thought visibly for a moment. "Look here, let's get together and frame it up. Willing to listen?" Martin nodded. "This is a small laundry up country. Belongs to Shelley Hot Springs. Hotel, you know. 2 men do the work, boss and assistant. I'm the boss. You don't work for me, but you work under me. Think you'd be willing to learn?" Martin paused to think. The prospect was alluring. A few months of it, and he would have time to himself for study. He could work hard and study hard. "Good grub, and a room to yourself," Joe said. That settled it. A room to himself, where he could burn the midnight oil unmolested. "But work like hell," the other added. Martin caressed his swelling shoulder muscles significantly. "That came from hard work." "Then let's get to it." Joe held his hand to his head for a moment. "Gee, but it's a stem winder. Can hardly see. I went down the line last night. Everything, everything. Here's the frame-up. The wages for 2 is 100 and board. I've been drawing down 60, the second man 40. But he knew the biz. You're green. If I break you in, I'll be doing plenty of your work at first. Suppose you begin at 30 and work up to the 40. I'll play fair. Just as soon as you can do your share, you get the 40. "I'll go you," Martin announced, stretching out his hand, which the other shook. "Any advance for railroad ticket and extras?" "I blew it in," was Joe's sad answer, with another reach at his aching head. "All I got is a return ticket. And I'm broke when I pay my board." "Jump it," Joe advised. "Can't. Owe it to my sister." Joe whistled a long, perplexed whistle and racked his brains to little purpose. "I've got the price of the drinks," he said desperately. "Come on, and maybe we can cook up something." Martin declined. "Water wagon?" This time Martin nodded, and Joe lamented. "Wish I was." "But I somehow just can't," he said in extenuation. "After I've been working like hell all week, I just got to booze it up. If I didn't, I'd cut my throat or burn up the premises. But I'm glad you're on the wagon. Stay with it." Martin knew of the enormous gulf between him and this man, the gulf the books had made, but he found no difficulty in crossing back over that gulf. He had lived all his life in the working-class world, and the camaraderie of labor was second nature with him. He solved the difficulty of transportation that was too much for the other's aching head. He would send his trunk up to Shelley Hot Springs on Joe's ticket. As for himself, there was his wheel. It was 70 miles, and he could ride it on Sunday and be ready for work Monday morning. In the meantime, he would go home and pack up. There was no one to say goodbye to. Ruth and her whole family were spending the long summer in the Sierras, at Lake Tahoe. He arrived in Shelley Hot Springs, tired and dusty, on Sunday night. Joe greeted him exuberantly. With a wet towel bound around his aching brow, he had been at work all day. "Part of last week's washin' mounted up, me being away to get you," he explained. "Your box arrived last night. It's in your room, but it's a hell of a thing to call a trunk. And what's in it? Gold bricks?" Joe sat on the bed while Martin unpacked. The box was a packing case for breakfast food, and Mr. Higginbotham had charged him $50 for it. 2 rope handles, nailed on by Martin, had technically transformed it into a trunk, eligible for the baggage car. Joe watched, with bulging eyes, a few shirts and several changes of underclothes come out of the box, followed by books and more books. "Books clean to the bottom?" he asked. Martin nodded and went on arranging the books on a kitchen table, which served in the room in place of a washstand. "Gee!" Joe exploded, then waited in silence for the deduction to arise in his brain. At last it came. "Say, you don't care for girls much?" he queried. "No," was the answer. "I used to chase a lot before I tackled the books, but since then there's no time." "And there won't be any time here. All you can do is work and sleep." Martin thought of his 5 hours sleep a night and smiled. The room was situated over the laundry and was in the same building with the engine that pumped water, made electricity, and ran the laundry machinery. The engineer, who occupied the adjoining room, dropped in to meet the new hand, and helped Martin rig up an electric bulb on an extension wire so that it traveled along a stretched cord from over the table to the bed. The next morning, at 6:15, Martin was routed out for a 6:45 breakfast. There happened to be a bathtub for the servants in the laundry building, and he electrified Joe by taking a cold bath. "Gee, but you're a hummer," Joe announced, as they sat down to breakfast in a corner of the hotel kitchen. With them was the engineer, the gardener, and the assistant gardener, and 2 or 3 men from the stable. They ate hurriedly and gloomily, but with little conversation, and as Martin ate and listened, he realized how far he had traveled from their status. The small mental caliber was depressing to him, and he was anxious to get away from them. So he bolted his breakfast, a sickly, sloppy affair, as rapidly as they, and heaved a sigh of relief when he passed out through the kitchen door. It was a perfectly appointed, small steam laundry, wherein the most modern machinery did everything that was possible for machinery to do. Martin, after a few instructions, sorted the great heaps of soiled clothes, while Joe started the masher and made up fresh supplies of soft soap, compounded of biting chemicals, that compelled him to swathe his mouth and nostrils and eyes in bath towels till he resembled a mummy. Finished the sorting, Martin lent a hand in wringing the clothes. This was done by dumping them into a spinning receptacle that went at a rate of a few thousand revolutions a minute, tearing the matter from the clothes by centrifugal force. Then Martin began to alternate between the dryer and the wringer, between times shaking out socks and stockings. By the afternoon, one feeding and one stacking up, they were running socks and stockings through the mangle, while the irons were heating. Then it was hot irons and underclothes till 6 o'clock, at which time Joe shook his head dubiously. "Way behind," he said. "Got to work after supper." And after supper they worked until 10 o'clock, under the blazing electric lights, until the last piece of underclothing was ironed and folded away in the distributing room. It was a hot California night, and though the windows were thrown wide, the room, with its red-hot ironing stove, was a furnace. Martin and Joe, down to undershirts, bare-armed, sweated and panted for air. "Like trimming cargo in the tropics," Martin said when they went upstairs. "You'll do," Joe answered. "You'll take hold like a good fellow. If you keep up the pace, you'll be on $30 only 1 month. The second month you'll be getting your 40. But don't tell me you never ironed before. I know better." "Never ironed a rag in my life, honestly, until today," Martin protested. He was surprised at his weariness when he got into his room, forgetful of the fact that he had been up on his feet and working without let-up for 14 hours. He set the alarm clock at 6, and measured back 5 hours to 1 o'clock. He could read until then. Slipping off his shoes to ease his swollen feet, he sat down at the table with his books. He opened Fisk where he had left off to read, but he found trouble began to read it through a second time. Then he awoke, in pain from his stiffened muscles, and chilled by the mountain wind that had begun to blow in through the window. He looked at the clock. It marked 2. He had been asleep 4 hours. He pulled off his clothes and crawled into bed, where he was asleep the moment after his head touched the pillow. Tuesday was a day of similar unremitting toil. The speed with which Joe worked won Martin's admiration. Joe was a dozen of demons for work. He was keyed up to concert pitch, and there was never a moment in the long day when he was not fighting for moments. He concentrated himself upon his work and upon how to save time, pointing out to Martin where he did in 5 motions what could be done in 3, or in 3 motions what could be done in 2. Elimination of waste motion, Martin phrased it as he watched and patterned after. He was a good workman himself, quick and deft, and it had always been a point of pride with him that no man should do any of his work for him or outwork him. As a result, he concentrated with a similar singleness of purpose, greedily snapping up the hints and suggestions thrown out by his working mate. He rubbed out collars and cuffs, rubbing the starch out from between the double thicknesses of linen, so that there would be no blisters when it came to the ironing, and doing it at a pace that elicited Joe's praise. There was never an interval when something was not at hand to be done. Joe waited for nothing, waited on nothing, and went on the jump from task to task. They starched 200 white shirts, with a single gathering movement, seizing a shirt so that the wristbands, neckband, yoke, and bosom protruded beyond the circling right hand. At the same moment the left hand held up the body of the shirt so that it would not enter the starch, and at the moment the right hand dipped into the starch so hot that, in order to wring it out, their hands had to thrust and thrust continually into a bucket of cold water. And that night they worked till 10:30, dipping fancy starch, all the frilled and airy delicate wear of ladies. "Me for the tropics and no clothes," Martin laughed. "And me out of a job," Joe answered seriously. "I don't know nothing but laundrying. And you know it well. I ought to. Began in the Contra Costa in Oakland when I was 11, shaking out for the mangle. That was 18 years ago, and I never done a tap of anything else. But this job is the fiercest I ever had. Ought to be one more man on it at least. We work tomorrow night. Always run the mangle Wednesday nights. Collars and cuffs." Martin set his alarm, drew up to the table, and opened Fisk. He did not finish the first paragraph. The lines blurred and ran together, and his head nodded. He walked up and down, batting his head savagely with his fists, but he could not conquer the numbness of sleep. He propped the book before him, and propped his eyelids open with his fingers, and fell asleep with his eyes wide open. Then he surrendered, and, scarcely conscious of what he did, got off his clothes and into bed. He slept 7 hours of heavy, animal-like sleep, and awoke by the alarm, feeling that he had not had enough. "Doing much readin'?" Joe asked. Martin shook his head. "Never mind. We got to run the mangle tonight, but Thursday we'll knock off at 6. That'll give you a chance." Martin washed woolens that day, by hand, in a large barrel, with strong soft soap, by means of a hub from a wagon wheel, mounted on a plunger pole that was attached to a spring pole overhead. "My invention," Joe said proudly. "Beats a washboard in your knuckles, and besides, it saves at least 15 minutes in the week, and 15 minutes ain't to be sneezed at this shebang." Running the collars and cuffs through the mangle was also Joe's idea. That night, while they toiled on under the electric lights, he explained it. "Something no laundry ever does except this one, and I got to do it if I'm going to get done Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. But I know how, and there's the difference. Got to have the right heat, right pressure, and run 'em through 3 times. Look at that." He held a cuff aloft. "Couldn't do it better by hand or on a tiler." Thursday, Joe was in a rage. A bundle of extra fancy starch had come in. "I'm going to quit," he announced. "I won't stand for it. I'm going to quit it cold. What's the good of me working like a slave all week, a-saving minutes, and then a-comin' and ringing in fancy starch extras on me? This is a free country, and I'm to tell that fat Dutchman what I think of him. And I won't tell him in French. Plain United States is good enough for me. Him a-ringin' in fancy starch extras. "We got to work tonight," he said the next moment, reversing his judgment and surrendering to fate. And Martin did no reading that night. He had seen no daily paper all week, and, strangely to him, felt no desire to see one. He was not interested in the news. He was too tired and jaded to be interested in anything, though he planned to leave Saturday afternoon, if they finished at 3, and ride on his wheel to Oakland. It was 70 miles, and the same distance back on Sunday afternoon would leave him anything but rested for the second week's work. It would have been easier to go on the train, but the round trip was $2.50, and he was intent on saving money. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Martin learned to do many things. In the course of the first week, in one afternoon, he and Joe accounted for the 200 white shirts. Joe ran the tiler, a machine wherein a hot iron was hooked on a steel string, which furnished the pressure. By this means he ironed the yoke, wristbands, and neckband, setting the latter at right angles to the shirt, and put the glossy finish on the bosom. As fast as he finished them, he flung the shirts on a rack between him and Martin, who caught them up and backed them. This task consisted of ironing all the unstarched portions of the shirt. It was exhausting work, carried on hour after hour at top speed. Out of the broad verandas of the hotel, men and women, in cool white, sipped iced drinks and kept their circulation down. But in the laundry the air was sizzling. The huge stove roared red-hot and white-hot, while the irons, moving over the damp cloth, sent up clouds of steam. The heat of these irons was different from that used by housewives. An iron that stood the ordinary test of a wet finger was too cold for Joe and Martin, and such test was useless. They went wholly by holding the irons close to their cheeks, gauging the heat by some secret mental process that Martin admired but could not understand. When the fresh irons proved too hot, they hooked them on iron rods and dipped them into cold water. This again required a precise and subtle judgment. A fraction of a second too long in the water, and the fine and silken edge of the proper heat was lost, and Martin found time to marvel at the accuracy he developed. An automatic accuracy, founded upon criteria that were machine-like and unerring. But there was little time in which to marvel. All Martin's consciousness was concentrated in the work. Ceaselessly active, head and hand, an intelligent machine, all that constituted him a man was devoted to furnishing that intelligence. There was no room in his brain for the universe and its mighty problems. All the broad and spacious corridors of his mind were closed and hermetically sealed. The echoing chamber of his soul was a narrow room, a conning tower, whence were directed his arm and shoulder muscles, his 10 nimble fingers, and the swift-moving iron along its steaming path in broad sweeping strokes, just so many strokes and no more, just so far with each stroke, and not a fraction of an inch farther, rushing along interminable sleeves, sides, backs, and tails, and tossing the finished shirts, without rumpling, upon the receiving frame. And even as his hurrying soul tossed, it was reaching for another shirt. This went on hour after hour, while outside the world swooned under the overhead California sun. But there was no swooning in that superheated room. The cool guests on the veranda needed clean linen. The sweat poured from Martin. He drank enormous quantities of water, but so great was the heat of the day and his exertions that the water sluiced through the interstices of his flesh and out at all his pores. Always at sea, except at rare intervals, the work he performed had given him ample opportunity to commune with himself. The master of the ship had been lord of Martin's time, but here the manager of the hotel was lord of Martin's thoughts as well. He had no thoughts save for the nerve-racking, body-destroying toil. Outside of that it was impossible to think. He did not know that he loved Ruth. She did not even exist, for his driven soul had no time to remember her. It was only when he crawled to bed at night, or to breakfast in the morning, that she asserted herself to him in fleeting memories. "This is hell, ain't it?" Joe remarked once. Martin nodded, but felt a rasp of irritation. The statement had been obvious and unnecessary. They did not talk while they worked. Conversation threw them out of their stride, as it did this time, compelling Martin to miss a stroke of his iron and to make 2 extra motions before he caught his stride again. On Friday morning the washer ran. Twice a week they had to put through hotel linen, the sheets, pillow slips, spreads, tablecloths, and napkins. This finished, they buckled down to fancy starch. It was slow work, fastidious and delicate, and Martin did not learn it so readily. Besides, he could not take chances. Mistakes were disastrous. "See that?" Joe said, holding up a filmy corset cover that could have been crumpled from view in one hand. "Scorch that, and it's $20 out of your wages." So Martin did not scorch that, and eased down on his muscular tension, though nervous tension rose higher than ever, and he listened sympathetically to the other's blasphemies as he toiled and suffered over the beautiful things that women wear when they do not have to do their own laundrying. Fancy starch was Martin's nightmare, and it was Joe's too. It was fancy starch that robbed them of their hard-won minutes. They toiled at it all day. At 7 in the evening they broke off to run the hotel linen through the mangle. At 10 o'clock, while the hotel guests slept, the 2 laundrymen sweated on at fancy starch till midnight, till 1, till 2. At 2:30 they knocked off. Saturday morning it was fancy starch and odds and ends, and at 3 in the afternoon the week's work was done. "You ain't going to ride them 70 miles into Oakland on top of this?" Joe demanded, as they sat on the stairs and took a triumphant smoke. "Got to," was the answer. "What are you going for, a girl?" "No, to save 2.5 on the railroad ticket. I want to renew some books at the library." "Why don't you send 'em up and down by express? That'll cost you only a quarter each way." Martin considered it. "And take a rest tomorrow," the other urged. "You need it. I know I do. I'm plumb tuckered out." He looked it. Indomitable, never resting, fighting for seconds and minutes all week, circumventing delays and crushing down obstacles, a fount of resistless energy, a high-driven human motor, a demon for work. Now that he had accomplished the week's task, he was in a state of collapse. He was worn and haggard, and his handsome face drooped in lean exhaustion. He pulled his cigarette spiritlessly, and his voice was peculiarly dead and monotonous. All the snap and fire had gone out of him. His triumph seemed a sorry one. "And next week we got to do it all over again," he said sadly. "And what's the good of it all, hey? Sometimes I wish I was a hobo. They don't work, and they got their living. Gee, I wish I had a glass of beer. But I can't get up the gumption to go down to the village and get it. You'll stay over and send your books dawn by express, or else you're a damn fool." "But what can I do here all Sunday?" Martin asked. "Rest. You don't know how tired you are. Why, I'm that tired Sunday I can't even read the papers. I was sick once, typhoid. In the hospital 2 months and a half. Didn't do a tap of work all that time. It was beautiful." "It was beautiful," he repeated dreamily, a minute later. Martin took a bath, after which he found that the head laundryman had disappeared. Most likely he had gone for a glass of beer, Martin decided, but the half-mile walk down to the village to find out seemed a long journey to him. He lay on his bed with his shoes off, trying to make up his mind. He did not reach out for a book. He was too tired to feel sleepy, and he lay, scarcely thinking, in a semi-stupor of weariness, until it was time for supper. Joe did not appear for that function, and when Martin heard the gardener remark that most likely he was ripping the slats off the bar, Martin understood. He went to bed immediately afterward, and in the morning decided that he was greatly rested. Joe being still absent, Martin procured a Sunday paper and lay down in a shady nook under the trees. The morning passed, he knew not how. He did not sleep, nobody disturbed him, and he did not finish the paper. He came back to it in the afternoon, after dinner, and fell asleep over it. So passed Sunday, and Monday morning he was hard at work sorting clothes, while Joe, a towel bound tightly around his head, with groans and blasphemies, was running the washer and mixing soft soap. "I simply can't help it," he explained. "I got to drink when Saturday night comes around." Another week passed, a great battle that continued under the electric lights each night, and that culminated on Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, when Joe tasted his moment of wilted triumph, and they drifted down to the village to forget. Martin's Sunday was the same as before. He slept in the shade of the trees, toiled aimlessly through the newspaper, and spent long hours lying on his back, doing nothing, thinking nothing. He was too dazed to think, though he was aware that he did not like himself. He was self-repelled, as though he had undergone some degradation or was intrinsically foul. All that was godlike in him was blotted out. The spur of ambition was blunted. He had no vitality with which to feel the prod of it. He was dead. His soul seemed dead. He was a beast, a work beast. He saw no beauty in the sunshine sifting down through the green leaves, nor did the azure vault of the sky whisper as of old and hint of cosmic vastness and secrets trembling to disclosure. Life was intolerably dull and stupid, and its taste was bad in his mouth. A black screen was drawn across his mirror of inner vision, and fancy lay in a darkened sick-room where entered no ray of light. He envied Joe, down in the village, rampant, tearing the slats off the bar, his brain gnawing with maggots, exulting in maudlin ways over maudlin things, fantastically and gloriously drunk, and forgetful of Monday morning and the week of deadening toil to come. A third week went by, and Martin loathed himself and loathed life. He was oppressed by a sense of failure. There was reason for the editors refusing his stuff. He could see that clearly now, and laugh at himself and the dreams he had dreamed. Ruth returned his sea lyrics by mail. He read her letter apathetically. She did her best to say how much she liked them and that they were beautiful. But she could not lie, and she could not disguise the truth from herself. She knew they were failures, and he read her disapproval in every perfunctory and unenthusiastic line of her letter. And she was right. He was firmly convinced of it as he read the poems over. Beauty and wonder had departed from him. And as he read the poems he caught himself puzzling as to what he had had in mind when he wrote them. His audacities of phrase struck him as grotesque. His felicities of expression were monstrosities, and everything was absurd, unreal, and impossible. He would have burned the sea lyrics on the spot, had his will been strong enough to set them aflame. There was the engine room, but the exertion of carrying them to the furnace was not worth while. All his exertion was used in washing other persons' clothes. He did not have any left for private affairs. He resolved that when Sunday came, he would pull himself together and answer Ruth's letter. But Saturday afternoon, after work was finished and he had taken a bath, the desire to forget overpowered him. "I guess I'll go down and see how Joe's getting on," was the way he put it to himself. And in the moment he knew that he lied. But he did not have the energy to consider the lie. If he had had the energy, he would have refused to consider the lie, because he wanted to forget. He started for the village slowly and casually, increasing his pace in spite of himself as he neared the saloon. "I thought you was on the water wagon," was Joe's greeting. Martin did not deign to offer excuses, but called for whiskey, filling his own glass brimming before he passed the bottle. "Don't take all night about it," he said roughly. The other was dawdling with the bottle, and Martin refused to wait for him, tossing the glass off in a gulp and refilling it. "Now I can wait for you," he said grimly, "but hurry up." Joe hurried, and they drank together. "That did the work, eh?" Joe queried. Martin refused to discuss the matter. "It's fair hell, I know," the other went on, "but I kind of hate to see you come off the wagon, Mart. Well, here's how." Martin drank on silently, biting out his orders and invitations and awing the barkeeper, an effeminate country youngster with watery blue eyes and hair parted in the middle. "It's something scandalous the way they work us poor devils," Joe was remarking. "If I didn't bowl up, I'd break loose and burn down the shebang. My bowling up is all that saves 'em, I can tell you that." But Martin made no answer. A few more drinks, and in his brain he felt the maggots of intoxication beginning to crawl. Ah, it was living, the first breath of life he had breathed in 3 weeks. His dreams came back to him. Fancy came out of the darkened room and lured him, a thing of flaming brightness. His mirror of vision was silver clear, a flashing, dazzling palimpsest of imagery. Wonder and beauty walked with him, hand in hand, and all power was his. He tried to tell it to Joe, but Joe had visions of his own, infallible schemes whereby he would escape the slavery of laundry work and become himself the owner of a great steam laundry. "I tell you, Mart, they won't be no kids workin' in my laundry, not on your life. And they won't be no workin' a livin' soul after 6 p.m. You hear me talk. There'll be machinery enough and hands enough to do it all in decent workin' hours. And Mart, so help me, I'll make you superintendent of the shebang, the whole of it, all of it. Now, here's the scheme. I get on the water wagon and save my money for 2 years. Save, and then—" But Martin turned away, leaving him to tell it to the barkeeper, until that worthy was called away to furnish drinks to 2 farmers who, coming in, accepted Martin's invitation. Martin dispensed royal largesse, inviting everybody up, farm-hands, a stableman, and the gardener's assistant from the hotel, the barkeeper, and the furtive hobo who slid in like a shadow, and like a shadow hovered at the end of the bar. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Monday morning, Joe groaned over the first truckload of clothes to the washer. "I say," he began. "Don't talk to me," Martin snarled. "I'm sorry, Joe," he said at noon, when they knocked off for dinner. Tears came into the other's eyes. "That's all right, old man," he said. "We're in hell, and we can't help ourselves. And, you know, I kind of like you a whole lot. That's what made it hurt. I cottoned to you from the first." Martin shook his hand. "Let's quit," Joe suggested. "Let's chuck it, and go hoboing. I ain't never tried it, but it must be dead easy, and nothing to do. Just think of it, nothing to do. I was sick once, typhoid, in the hospital, and it was beautiful. I wish I'd get sick again." The week dragged on. The hotel was full, and extra fancy starch poured in upon them. They performed prodigies of valor. They fought late each night under the electric lights, bolted their meals, and even got in a half-hour's work before breakfast. Martin no longer took his cold baths. Every moment was drive, 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 and Joe was the masterful shepherd of moments, herding them carefully, never losing one, counting them over like a miser counting gold, working on in a frenzy, toil-mad, a feverish machine, aided ably by that other machine that thought of itself as once having been one Martin Eden, a man. But it was only at rare moments that Martin was able to think. The house of thought was closed, its windows boarded up, and he was its shadowy caretaker. He was a shadow. Joe was right. They were both shadows, and this was the unending limbo of toil. Or was it a dream? Sometimes, in the steaming, sizzling heat, as he swung the heavy irons back and forth over the white garments, it came to him that it was a dream. In a short while, or maybe after 1,000 years or so, he would awake, in his little room with the ink-stained table, and take up writing where he had left off the day before. Or maybe that was a dream too, and the awakening would be the changing of the watches, when he would drop down out of his bunk in the lurching forecastle and go up on deck under the tropic stars, and take the wheel and feel the cool trade wind blowing through his flesh. Came Saturday, and its hollow victory at 3 o'clock. "Guess I'll go down and get a glass of beer," Joe said, in the queer monotonous tones that marked his weekend collapse. Martin seemed suddenly to wake up. He opened the kit bag and oiled his wheel, putting graphite on the chain and adjusting the bearings. Joe was halfway down to the saloon when Martin passed by, bending low over the handlebars, his legs driving the 96 gear with rhythmic strength, his face set for 70 miles of road and grade and dust. He slept in Oakland that night, and on Sunday covered the 70 miles back, and on Monday morning, weary, he began the new week's work. But he had kept sober. A fifth week passed, and a sixth, during which he lived and toiled as a machine, with just a spark of something more in him, just a glimmering bit of soul that compelled him, at each weekend, to scorch off the 140 miles. But this was not rest. It was super-machine-like, and it helped to crush out the glimmering bit of soul that was all that was left him from his former life. At the end of the 7th week, without intending it, too weak to resist, he drifted down to the village with Joe, and drowned life and found life until Monday morning. Again, at the weekends, he ground out the 140 miles, obliterating the numbness of too great exertion by the numbness of still greater exertion. At the end of 3 months, he went down a third time to the village with Joe. He forgot and lived again, and, living, he saw, in clear illumination, the beast he was making of himself, not by the drink, but by the work. The drink was an effect, not a cause. It followed inevitably upon the work, as the night follows upon the day. Not by becoming a toil beast could he win to the heights, was the message the whiskey whispered to him, and he nodded approbation. The whiskey was wise. It told secrets on itself. He called for paper and pencil, and for drinks all around, and while they drank his very good health, he clung to the bar and scribbled. "A telegram, Joe," he said. "Read it." Joe read it with a drunken quizzical leer, but what he read seemed to sober him. He looked at the other reproachfully, tears oozing into his eyes and down his cheeks. "You ain't going back on me, Mart?" he queried hopelessly. Martin nodded, and called one of the loungers to him to take the message to the telegraph office. "Hold on," Joe muttered thickly. "Let me think." He held on to the bar, his legs wobbling under him, Martin's arm around him and supporting him, while he thought. "Make that 2 laundrymen," he said abruptly. "Here, let me fix it." "What are you quitting for?" Martin demanded. "Same reason as you. But I'm going to see. You can't do that." "Nope," was the answer. "But I can hobo all right, all right." Martin looked at him searchingly for a moment, then cried, "By God, I think you're right. Better a hobo than a beast of toil. Why, man, you'll live, and that's more than you ever did before." "I was in hospital once," Joe corrected. "It was beautiful. Typhoid, did I tell you?" While Martin changed the telegram to 2 laundrymen, Joe went on. "I never wanted to drink when I was in hospital. Funny, ain't it? But when I've been working like a slave all week, I got to bowl up. Ever notice that cooks drink like hell, and bakers too? It's the work. They've sure got to. Here, let me pay half of that telegram." "I'll shake you for it," Martin offered. "Come on, everybody drink," Joe called, as they rattled the dice and rolled them out on the damp bar. Monday morning Joe was wild with anticipation. He did not mind his aching head, nor did he take interest in his work. Whole herds of moments stole away and were lost, while their careless shepherd gazed out of the window at the sunshine and the trees. "Just look at it," he cried, "and it's all mine. It's free. I can lie down under them trees and sleep for 1,000 years if I want to. Aw, come on, Mart, let's chuck it. What's the good of waiting another moment? That's the land of nothing to do out there, and I got a ticket for it, and it ain't no return ticket, by gosh." A few minutes later, filling the truck with soiled clothes for the washer, Joe spied the hotel manager's shirt. He knew its mark, and with a sudden glorious consciousness of freedom, he threw it on the floor and stamped on it. "I wish you was in it, you pig-headed Dutchman," he shouted. "In it and right there where I've got you. Take that and that and that, damn you. Hold me back, somebody. Hold me back." Martin laughed and held him to his work. On Tuesday night, the new laundrymen arrived, and the rest of the week was spent breaking them into the routine. Joe sat around and explained his system, but he did no more work. "Not a tap," he announced. "Not a tap. They can fire me if they want to, but if they do, I'll quit. No more work in mine, thank you kindly. Me for the freight cars and the shade under the trees. Go to it, you slaves. That's right. Slave and sweat, slave and sweat. And when you're dead, you'll rot the same as me. And what's it matter how you live, eh? Tell me that. What's it matter in the long run?" On Saturday, they drew their pay and came to the parting of the ways. "They ain't no use in me asking you to change your mind and hit the road with me?" Joe asked hopelessly. Martin shook his head. He was standing by his wheel, ready to start. They shook hands, and Joe held on to his for a moment, as he said, "I'm going to see you again, Mart, before you and me die. That's straight dope. I feel it in my bones. Good-bye, Mart, and be good. I like you like hell, you know." He stood, a forlorn figure, in the middle of the road, watching until Martin turned a bend and was gone from sight. "He's a good Indian, that boy," he muttered. "A good Indian." Then he plodded down the road himself, to the water tank, where half a dozen empties lay on a sidetrack, waiting for the up freight. End of chapter 18.